Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace to each and every one of you, dear esteemed guests. It is my pleasure to be with you today for this special event. My name is Sulaiman Ba, and I am the Community Engagement and Outreach person here at the Minalatayn Center. It is one of the centers, a member of Qatar Foundation, and it's my pleasure, like I said, to be with you so we can learn and exchange, and I get this opportunity to have a front row seat to actually hear a very timely discussion. This webinar is organized jointly by Qatar Foundation's Quranic Botanic Garden and by the Missouri Botanical Garden in the United States. And it falls as part of the Qatar-USA 2021 Year of Culture. And basically it's bringing together ecology experts from the US, from Qatar, and other scholars and experts as well from the Botanic Gardens Conservation International, the Royal Botanical Garden of Jordan, the Royal Botanical Gardens Q in the United Kingdom, and to discuss basically the title of this event is the Species Recovery and Ecological Restoration, the Developing Roles of Botanic Gardens. So the importance of Botanic Gardens as it does its work, its day-to-day work, and to reverse the degradation of ecosystems and combating climate change. And I think, again, it's a very timely discussion coming just on the heels of the COP26, which ended in Glasgow. I think they went into overtime until Saturday, but where, heads of state, state actors and non-state actors, civil society meet to try and basically align on a global stage for a shared planet, a shared world that we all call home, and how to make it better and brighter and healthier for ourselves and for future generations. So today we have the pleasure of welcoming these experts and to hear from them, their insight, their expertise, and the research that they've been working on. I think for what will be an invaluable event where ideas will be exchanged, basically that's what brings us here today. So I'm excited, and I hope that you will, the audience as well, watching from your respective corners of the globe, will stay until the end of the session for a fruitful discussion. Feel free to chime in and put in your chats, but I think there'll be, to respect the speaker's time that is allotted to each speaker, about 15 minutes. We will try to have the discussion at the end before wrapping up. So just a couple of things worth mentioning for the benefit of everybody who's joining us. The webinar will be held, it is in English, but there is simultaneous Arabic interpretation that is going to happen, and you will be able to access that if you click on the globe icon on your screen to be able to access the other language of choice. There also will be a certificate of attendance to those who will be participating, and hopefully towards the end you'll be able to, there'll be a link provided, you'll be able to share your information and contact details where it will be sent to you electronically. So thank you all very much for joining us, and with that said, I would love to give the floor to our first speaker to open up the this webinar, and it's Ms. Fatma Al-Khalaifi, who's the director of the Quranic Botanic Garden here, a member of Qatar Foundation, for her to give her welcoming talk, and then to also talk about the work that they've been doing at the Quranic Botanic Garden. So Ms. Fatma Al-Khalaifi, the floor is yours, and welcome.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I excuse all of my guests that I'm going to speak in Arabic this time. Inshallah, you can see my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yeah, I see. Yes, screen is great.
السيدات والسادة الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يطيب لي أن أرحب بجميع المشاركين والمتحدثين المتميزين في هذه الندوة العلمية المشتركة لحديقة القرآن النباتية عضو مؤسسة قطر وحديقة ميسوري النباتية في إطار العام الثقافي قطر الولايات المتحدة 2021. كما أود أن أشكر الدكتور بيتر ويز جاكسون رئيس حديقة ميسوري على دعمه في بناء جسر التعاون بين الحديقتين، وأرحب بالدكتور بول سميث أمين عام المنظمة الدولية لحفظ الحدائق النباتية. اخترنا لندوتنا اليوم عنوان نحو دور جديد للحدائق النباتية، الحفاظ على الأنواع واستعادة النظم البيئية. نهدف في هذه الندوة أن نسلط الضوء على الأدوار الجديدة للحدائق النباتية في الحفاظ على الأنواع النباتية واستعادة النظم البيئية، وهنا تتمثل في صون عدد من المجتمعات النباتية تحت سقف واحد، وكذلك العمل على إحياء الأراضي بإعادة استزراعها. كذلك نهدف لتبادل المعرفة وبناء العلاقات والشراكات بين الحدائق النباتية، طبعا هذا بالإضافة لدعم عقد الأمم المتحدة لاستعادة النظام البيئي للأعوام 2021-2030 ومنع تدهور النظم البيئية ومكافحة تغير المناخ ومنع الانقراض الجماعي للكائنات خاصة النباتات. من خلال تنظيم هذا اللقاء سوف نتعرض لعدد من القضايا الهامة، لعل أهمها الاستراتيجيات والأنظمة العالمية لحفظ التنوع النباتي، وكذلك البرامج التقنية لصون النباتات في موائلها الداخلية والخارجية. ولكن بداية أود أن أعرض الأدوار التي تضطلع بها حديقة القرآن على المستوى المحلي. أولاً الدور البيئي، وتعتني حديقة القرآن طبعاً بصون أنواع نباتية مختلفة المذكورة في القرآن وفي الحديث الشريف، وجمعت من مناطق بيئية جغرافية مختلفة، بالإضافة إلى عنايتنا بالنباتات الفطرية في دولة قطر. كذلك نعني برفع الوعي البيئي والتشجيع على صون الموارد الطبيعية، مثال على ذلك حملة غرس المجتمعية وبرنامج إحياء الأرض الذي تقوم وزارة البلدية بالتعاون معنا في هذا البرنامج. من أدوارنا كذلك الدور العلمي، تقوم حديقة القرآن النباتية على برنامج علمي لصون النباتات التي تنتمي لبيئات جغرافية متنوعة داخل وخارج موائلها الطبيعية. كما نقوم بتنظيم اللقاءات العلمية مثل هذا اللقاء لتبادل الخبرات، طرح الأفكار الجديدة وأوراق العمل العملية والعلمية. كذلك نستقبل في مركز الصون النباتي التابع للحديقة الباحثين الذين يجرون دراساتهم على بيولوجية النباتات، ونمدهم بالأدوات التقنية والبيانات العلمية لتسهيل أبحاثهم. كذلك من بين الأدوار التي تطلع بها الحديقة الدور التعليمي، فقد أسست الحديقة برامج تعليمية فريدة في قطر تهدف إلى إنتاج معلومات أساسية وتطبيقات عملية حول النباتات والبيئة. من بين البرامج التي نطرحها برنامج امرح وتعلم لطلاب المرحلة الابتدائية، وبرنامج الباحث اليافع لطلاب المرحلتين الإعدادية والثانوية، وكذلك برنامج الأمن الغذائي الذي انطلق بالتزامن مع الحصار على دولة قطر. الدور الثقافي من بين الأدوار التي تطلع بها الحديقة، حيث تتبنى حديقة القرآن النباتية إحياء التراث الثقافي، فيحتوي المتحف النباتي عندنا في الحديقة على مجموعة من الأدوات التراثية المتعلقة بالاستخدامات التقليدية للنباتات ودورها في حياة الإنسان. ونعرض في هذا المتحف المعلومات التقليدية والطرق المستدامة للاستفادة من تلك النباتات على المدى الطويل. خامساً وأخيراً الدور الترفيهي، كباقي الحدائق النباتية نتطلع لأن نكون الوجهة المميزة لكافة أفراد المجتمع وخاصة الأطفال والطلاب، خاصة أن حديقة القرآن حالياً تتميز بتمازج وتناغم مميز بين المسطحات الخضراء والتكوينات المائية. هذا بالنسبة لأدوارنا في المجتمع. حديقة القرآن النباتية تسهم محلياً في تفعيل خطة العمل الوطنية القطرية للتغير المناخي، بالأخص حول التنوع الحيوي من البند الخامس، وهو تدابير التكيف مع تغير المناخ. إذ تنفذ الحديقة العديد من المشاريع والمبادرات البيئية لاستعادة النظام البيئي لبر قطر وللحد من تأثير تغير المناخ، من بينها على سبيل المثال مبادرة إعادة إحياء روضة الفرس وإنشاء نموذج روضة مؤسسة قطر، بالإضافة للمحافظة على التنوع البيولوجي للغطاء النباتي في دولة قطر. فنحن نقوم أو نحن بصدد القيام بدراسة لرصد النباتات المهددة بالانقراض، وأترك فيما بعد لزملائي الخبراء في الحديقة للتحدث بالتفصيل عن هذه المبادرات. تسهم الحديقة كذلك في البند السادس من خطة العمل الوطنية للتغير المناخي، وهي عوامل التمكين والتنفيذ من خلال أولاً الوعي المجتمعي والاتصال، حيث نقوم في الحديقة بحملة غرس وهي معروفة عندنا موجهة لجميع شرائح المجتمع، كما نقدم ورش عمل زراعية متخصصة بالتعاون مع بنك قطر للتنمية. ثانياً نسهم في التثقيف البيئي. أذكر هنا البرامج التعليمية بالتعاون مع وزارة التعليم، فالحديقة تطرح مصاحبة للبرامج مسابقات مصاحبة للبرامج، كمسابقة المزارع المدرسية لإنتاج السلال الغذائية، كذلك المسابقات البيئية التي تدعو الطلاب لابتكار حلول لبعض التحديات البيئية، وأخيراً برنامج امرح وتعلم للأطفال دون عام 12 سنة. وثالثاً تكنولوجيا البحث والتطوير، حيث تقوم الحديقة ببعض الأبحاث مع بعض المؤسسات المعتمدة والقوية في الدولة، فنحن نقوم بدراسة أبحاث حول البصمة الوراثية لبعض النباتات مثل القسط الهندي وشجرة العود، كما نقوم باستخدام المركبات المغذية العضوية لزيادة نمو ونوعية أصناف من نخيل التمر القطرية، وكذلك نقوم بتجارب في طرق إكثار النباتات كشجرة الأراك بالعقل الغضة. بطبيعة الحال فإن حديقة القرآن النباتية كعضو في المنظمة الدولية لحفظ الحدائق النباتية BGCI فقد أسهمت دولياً في دعم الأهداف الاستراتيجية لحفظ النباتات من عام 2011 إلى 2022. هنا سأركز على بعض البنود من الاستراتيجية، منها البند الأول فهم وتوثيق التنوع النباتي. بالنسبة للهدف من هذا البند فإننا أتممنا بالتعاون مع مكتب اليونسكو في قطر وضع قائمة للتعريف بنباتات البيئة القطرية الفطرية لتحسين المعرفة بالتنوع البيولوجي، والتي ممكن تضمين هذه القائمة في موقع أونلاين فلورا، كما استكملنا النباتات المذكورة في القرآن وفي الحديث. عفواً. بالنسبة للهدف الثاني من هذا البند فإننا نقوم بدراسة بتقييم حالة الغطاء النباتي، والهدف الثالث نقوم بأبحاث مع وزارة البيئة وجامعة قطر لحفظ النباتات الفطرية في بيئة قطر، كما نعنى بحفظ النباتات المذكورة في القرآن والحديث من خلال برامج الصون وإعادة التأهيل بجمع البذور واستعادة إنباتها، ثم إعادة زراعة هذه الأشجار الصحراوية في موائلها الطبيعية. كذلك نسهم في الاستراتيجية العالمية في البند الرابع، وهو تعزيز التثقيف والتوعية بشأن التنوع النباتي. قمنا بتصميم برامج تعليمية وهي الآن معتمدة في وزارة التعليم، كما نقوم الآن بمشاركة جامعة حمد بن خليفة في مشروع مقاربة لمناهج التعليم في وزارة التعليم مع الأهداف التنموية لجميع المدارس في دولة قطر. أما بالنسبة للبند الخامس وهو بناء القدرات من أجل حفظ التنوع النباتي، فنحن نقوم بتدريب عملاء بنك قطر للتنمية، كما نقوم بطرح ورش عمل زراعية للعامة. حديقة القرآن النباتية بهذا كله تسعى للإسهام في الركيزة البيئية من رؤية قطر الوطنية 2030، والتي تحث على التصدي للتحديات التي يطرحها تغير المناخ. لعل استعادة الأراضي واحدة من الحلول الرئيسية لمواجهة تغير المناخ والحد من انبعاثات الكربون، وهذه رسالة من قطر للعالم للتحفيز نحو سلوك مستدام تجاه رعاية البيئة بغية الوصول لمجتمع بيئي متكامل يساهم بفاعلية في مساعي الدولة نحو الارتقاء بالتنمية البيئية المستدامة، طبعا وفقا لرؤية قطر الوطنية 2030. كل ما تم التطرق له في حديثي اليوم، وهذا التحرك البيئي هو مما يدعو له ديننا الحنيف في صون البيئة والحفاظ على التنوع البيولوجي وعدم إفساد هذا النظام الإيكولوجي، في قوله تعالى: وإذا تولى سعى في الأرض ليفسد فيها ويهلك الحرث والنسل والله لا يحب الفساد، من سورة البقرة. كذلك، وهذا لأن الله بين لنا في القرآن وفي مواقع أخرى أن هذا التنوع البيولوجي هو نعمة منه سبحانه وتعالى. وأذكر هنا الآية في قوله تعالى: وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. في الختام،
Hello, Ms. Fatima. Are you still there? Okay, so maybe I think there's some technical issue there just towards the end as she was giving her concluding remarks. Okay, so thank you very much, Ms. Fatima, for that, for the opening remarks and for that introduction on what you've been working on at the Quranic Botanic Garden. And now we would like to go to our next speaker. And it is my pleasure to give the floor next to Mr. Peter Wise Jackson. Is it Wise or Wise? I'm sorry.
It's Wise.
Wise. Okay, Peter Wise Jackson, I should have asked in the beginning, who's the president of the Missouri Botanical Gardens. And he will be speaking about botanical gardens and the global strategy for plant conservation. So the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. It is really a great pleasure for me to have been invited to present a talk at this webinar, co-hosted by the Quranic Botanic Garden and the Missouri Botanical Garden. This is certainly a wonderful way to honor the 2021 Qatar-USA Year of Culture. And as part of the collaborative, cooperative agreement we have between our two institutions, I'm very grateful to all of those who have undertaken the work, Dr. Fatima and the staff of the Quranic Botanic Garden for organizing this event, and very happy to welcome everyone who's participated today. We know the subject of the webinar as the species recovery and ecological restoration and the developing roles of botanic gardens. It is really an extremely important one and represents an emerging research direction for many botanic gardens. In the context of the twin global crises in biodiversity loss and climate change, plant conservation and ecological restoration have to be top priorities for the botanic garden community. In my presentation, I will give you a summary of the global strategy for plant conservation, how it is and how it continues to be central to the work of the botanic garden community worldwide. And that is important in terms of giving you the context of what our work is. We are all too aware that worldwide there are upwards of 100,000 plant species that are now threatened with extinction in the wild. And over the last few decades, the diverse botanic gardens throughout the world have responded strongly, and many of them very effectively, to adopting plant conservation as a top priority. This has included building plant conservation collections, undertaking new research in conservation biology, raising new public awareness of the threats of plants and to their habitats, and increasingly being involved in situ conservation. The number of botanic gardens has also grown very significantly too, from less than 800 botanic gardens worldwide in the 1980s to about 3,000 botanic gardens today. Many of them recently established primarily to support conservation of the native plants in their own countries and to promote public awareness of the importance of plants and the threats they face. The establishment of Botanic Gardens Conservation International in 1987 certainly played an influential role also in helping this shift in botanic garden priorities and in stimulating new plant conservation actions. Nevertheless, botanic gardens cannot tackle the plant conservation crisis on their own. And for that reason, in 2000, a group of concerned botanists worldwide petitioned the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. They asked for a new and urgent global focus to be put on plant conservation. And the result was that in 2002, a global strategy for plant conservation, the GSPC, was adopted by the convention and endorsed by almost every one of the world's countries. And its implementation has continued for almost 2 decades. The GSPC was an entirely new approach to biodiversity conservation, incorporating measurable outcomes for global targets for the first time. And since then, such targets have become the norm for most conventions like the Convention on Biological Diversity. Since 2002, the 16 plant conservation related targets have formed a backbone and a framework for the international community's work relating to plants and their habitats. The GSPC incorporates 5 objectives: understanding and documenting plant diversity, conserving plant diversity, using plant diversity sustainably, promoting education and awareness about plant diversity, and building capacity for plant conservation to achieve the targets of the strategy. In 2004, too, a global partnership for plant conservation was launched to support the worldwide implementation of the GSPC. And today that partnership includes about 60 national and international organizations as members, and BGCI provides its secretariat. This slide provides an overview of progress made up to 2020 in the achievement of the GSPC targets worldwide. One can see that there has been mixed success. Only one target was actually achieved, target 1, to establish a flora of the world online. But nevertheless, it has become clear that much more progress was made than would have been achieved if the GSPC had never existed. So some good progress has been made, but much more to do. The GSPC has been very successful in mobilizing the plant conservation community and also in stimulating significant responses from some countries, including some mega diverse countries. In implementation of the strategy. This slide shows and lists some of the key initiatives that were developed in response to the GSPC, including BGCI's threat search and the global trees assessment. And another notable initiative has been the creation of the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens, of which Kirsty Shaw will talk about later. But we are now in 2021, and officially the GSPC has come to a conclusion. Nevertheless, we are all aware that a new phase is required for a post-2020 GSPC, building on achievements, filling gaps and adopting new priorities to meet new challenges. Notable amongst these new priorities is new action needed in ecological restoration. The CBD's Conference of the Parties, COP14 meeting held in Egypt in 2018, welcomed such a development and asked the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation to assist in the formulation of an update. And this will be linked with the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that's currently being negotiated by the Convention and due for adoption in May next year at the CBD COP. But let me look very briefly at some of the proposed elements of a new draft post-2020 GSPC. To date, there are 23 draft targets proposed for a new GSPC for 2030. And these would be nested within and form a component of the Global Biodiversity Framework's targets too. They aim to be smart targets and fully measurable, and to be supported by a series of plant-specific indicators. This evolving draft GSPC has been provided as an information document on the CBD's Substa 24 meetings pages on the web, and can be consulted on the CBD's website. So if you want to look for more detail, I do urge you to go and take a look there. These are the key elements of the new GSPC targets. Promoting plant species and their habitats, or protecting plant species and their habitats, ecological restoration, incorporating plant conservation into international and national strategic frameworks and capacity building and building global awareness, ensuring that plants are sustainably harvested and traded, protecting traditional plant use and knowledge, and building the scientific knowledge of plants and conservation on which the successful achievement of new targets must be based. On ecological restoration, the new draft highlights the importance of restoration based on the use of native plants and their use in carbon sequestration and also in watershed protection. Botanic gardens have, as we know, multiple roles in supporting plant conservation and ecological restoration, and are ideally suited to implementing this new phase of the GSPC. But the GSPC also must become and is an important framework to guide the work of our own individual institutions worldwide, which allows us to coordinate and multiply our impacts. At the Missouri Botanical Garden, it is an essential framework for all we do in plant conservation. This slide illustrates just some aspects of the growing focus on conservation of the Missouri Botanical Garden. And I know that my colleagues who are online and will speak later will elaborate on some of these directions in our work during the program, both in terms of horticulture and research. But I want to finish by saying that we should all continue to urge our governments and representatives to press the Biodiversity Convention to adopt the post-2020 global strategy for plant conservation as a vital framework for plant preservation, conservation, and public awareness of the importance of plants going forward. This is really an essential part of the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and we cannot lose the momentum that has been achieved so far. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope that this has been a useful quick summary of why the importance of the GSPC must be stressed. Thank you very much, and I hand on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mr. Jackson for that. And I actually learned something. I mean, first of all, you highlighted the twin global challenge, climate change, which was probably addressed by COP26, but biodiversity loss, which probably doesn't get too much coverage, but hopefully is going to be mentioned tonight in this talk. And I think our next speaker also will probably be able to shed a lot more light on that. So it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Paul Smith, the Secretary General of the Botanic Gardens Conservation International, who will be speaking about BGCI's global system for the conservation of all known threatened tree species. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Suleiman. Appreciate that. And thank you for the invitation, everybody. It's greatly appreciated. And you'll be hearing from Kirsty later about ecological restoration. But I'm going to talk briefly in these 15 minutes about conserving species, and specifically threatened tree species. You all know the context, I think, and that is that many of the world's tree species are threatened with extinction. We think about 30% of those, which equates to over 17,000 species. And they are largely threatened by our own activities, land clearance for agriculture, forestry, urbanization, and so on, overexploitation and trade, pests and diseases, which quite often we introduce, invasive alien plant species in particular, and then climate change. The point here is that if we want to conserve plants, we need to proactively manage them in landscapes. And just here's a few examples. You know, when I talk about 17,500 threatened species, that includes over 2,000 tree species that are critically endangered, and over 440 that are down to fewer than 50 individuals left in the wild. So clearly we are in the middle of an extinction crisis, and we don't want to lose any of these species. The Hyophorby you can see on the left here is called the loneliest tree in the world. It's the only one of its kind remaining. So our aim in the botanical garden community is that no tree species becomes extinct. We need to conserve ex situ all threatened tree species, and that means for orthodox species, conserving them in genetically diverse seed collections in seed banks, and for exceptional species or recalcitrant species, conserving them in field gene banks, and again, making sure they're genetically diverse. We also need to make sure that the most threatened species are conserved in situ in their natural habitat. And I'll talk about how we can go about that, particularly through species recovery over the next few minutes. So we are aiming for all the most threatened tree species to be conserved and managed in situ. This is the current situation. Around 18,000 different tree species are grown in botanic garden collections ex situ, but currently only about 25% of threatened tree species. So we have a long way to go. In terms of what it costs to bank the seed of a single species, based on the Millennium Seed Banks methodologies, around only about $3,000 to bank a genetically diverse seed collection of a tree species. So this is something we should be doing. It's also worth remembering that it is possible to recover a species from a single seed or plant. And in fact, the picture there of Café Marron on Rodrigues in the Indian Ocean is an example of that. This plant was down to a single individual. It's now back in the wild in Grand Montane National Park. It's not ideal, but we should never give up. And that's because trees in particular are genetically resilient. We also know, a bit of good news, that around 2/3 of threatened tree species are in protected areas. But we also know that most are not adequately protected, and many critically endangered species are in unprotected transformed landscapes. So what does a rational, cost-effective global system look like for conserving tree species? The first thing you need to do, of course, is to identify the species most at risk and set your priorities. So BGCI, along with the Global Tree Specialist Group of IUCN and multiple partners around the world, leads the Global Tree Assessment currently. We published this interim report in September this year, State of the World's Trees. And we have a pretty good idea, as I say, of which species are most threatened. We will continue, though, to put those onto the IUCN Global List for 2023 and to make that information available. But already we know that there are 17,500 tree species threatened with extinction. Once we know which species are threatened, we need obviously to mobilize local and international partners. And as Peter's already shown, we have more than 3,000 botanical organizations around the world, not all botanic gardens, but forestry institutes, universities, and so on with strong botanical credentials. And BGCI has more than 650 member organizations in over 100 countries. They work in and operate in a wide range of habitats and diverse landscapes, and many of them work in protected areas, and I'm sure we'll hear about that later today. They also have world-class infrastructures, including the most sophisticated seed banks on the planet, plant nurseries, tissue culture laboratories, and so on. So here's a map of BGCI members, and you can see that they're all over the world, but that unfortunately most are in the Northern Hemisphere and not necessarily where plants are most threatened. And this is the importance then of a global network. And it's the people, of course, which are key to this, the skills, knowledge, the data that they hold. Within our network, we estimate there are around 60,000 scientists, horticulturists, and educators with expertise in all of these different disciplines that can be applied to plant conservation. We're going to hear a lot more about restoration ecology, so I'm not going to cover that in this talk, but right the way through from seed conservationists to taxonomists, geneticists, horticulturists, everyone has their part to play. So once we've mobilized our partners and we have our species identified, we need to empower those partners and enable them through training and financial support. And we have a wealth of information about species recovery. Q's Seed Information Database has germination protocols for about 60,000 different plant species, optimal germination protocols. We have leaflets, pamphlets, videos in multiple languages on how to carry out species recovery, many of them written for non-specialist audiences to help working with communities and so on to get better at species recovery. We also have, BGCI has a directory of expertise. If you want to find some specialist expertise within your region or within your species of interest, perhaps, you can search on these different criteria. We have, I think, 11 different directories of expertise for different disciplines. And of course, botanic gardens are really important as places of hubs for training. These are some figures from 2019, pre-COVID. These were BGCI trained people, 775 people from 67 countries. And important to say that 60% of those were not from botanical organizations. Our role at BGCI is to mobilize botanical expertise. And of course, that means training and working with local communities and helping them to conserve their biodiversity by giving them the skills and the knowledge that they need. So once we have our partners empowered, if you like, and trained, there's the conservation planning area, and that again is at the country level or at the species level. And when we launched the State of the World's Trees report, we also launched the Global Tree Portal, which you can find here on our website. And that gives you country data for every country in the world. It tells you how many native tree species there are, how many endemic tree species, how many of those are threatened, how many are in ex situ, and how many are in situ protected. And you can download the checklists. And for those species which are not conserved in seed banks or in botanic gardens or not conserved in the wild, then it's obviously a top priority for those countries to make sure that they are conserved. This way we can find the gaps and we can apply the technical interventions that we need to and the finance to ensure that no species becomes extinct. So an example from Kenya here. Kenya has 120 threatened tree species. We have an African Botanic Garden network and also a national network of institutions working together now to make sure that none of those 120 species become extinct. At the species level, for critically endangered species, we have a conservation tracker, which is on the right here, that tells us, is there a species conservation plan? Are there living collections? A whole bunch of questions there. Is somebody actually carrying out the conservation of this species as well? And again, where nobody is working on the recovery of these species, we can contact our partners and say, there's this species, it's in your geographical area, will you please work on its recovery? We can help you with funding and technical support and so on. So our final and most important step, of course, is targeted action taken for the most threatened tree species. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to whiz through these, but you'll see what I mean when we talk about communities of practice within the Global Botanical Garden community. We have over 200 BGCI members with native seed banks who can be deployed for the seed conservation work. For recalcitrant species or exceptional species, we've now set up these global conservation consortia for difficult to conserve taxa like magnolias and oaks and rhododendron. And the idea there is to build genetically comprehensive living gene banks within botanic gardens or in other protected areas, both as a backup insurance policy, but also so that we can learn more about these species so that we can save seed, reintroduce them wherever necessary. And we will continue to grow these groups. We have another one since I put this slide together, working on Nothofagus, the southern beaches. And then actually at the ground level, working on species recovery. I'd encourage you to have a look at this report called Securing a Future for the World's Threatened Tree Species, a global challenge. This is on our website, and it includes case studies, many case studies, 400 threatened tree species under recovery action over the last 10 or 15 years, and the various successes and failures, in trying to reintroduce and recover these species. I'd also encourage you to look at the Tree Conservation Fund, the website at the top there. If you are interested in incorporating threatened tree species into your tree planting or restoration programs, or if you have a threatened tree species that you would like to attract funding and attention for, then you should get in touch with us. And we use this as a showcase to try to interest funders and other supporters to help us with species recovery for many of these highly threatened tree species. I'm going to leave it there, be very aware of time. And the one element I've not mentioned, as I say, is ecological restoration, which Kirsty Shaw will talk about a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, you're making my job as a moderator very easy. All of the speakers so far have been very respectful of the time, but also very efficient, let's say, in terms of the amount of information you've delivered, but like packing a power punch. And I really might have to say that your background must be an educator, because I learned so much from your presentation. And I think a presentation like that needs to be shown in every school. I mean, that's how you get to train the future eco warriors, but they need to see those infographics, but also the resources where they can go look at themselves with the assessment tools and all these other resources that you listed out there. So I'm definitely going to be looking at them afterwards. But thank you very much for that, Mr. Paul Smith. Transitioning on to our next speaker, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Haytham Tayfour, who is the Conservation Unit Manager from the Royal Botanic Garden of Jordan. And he is going to be speaking about modeling actual and potential natural vegetation types as an approach to support the ecological restoration that's currently happening in Jordan. The floor is yours, Mr. Haytham Tayfour.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Jordan's experience in planning ecological restoration program in the country. Today, I will talk about the project that is part of my PhD study. According to the Society of Ecological Restoration International Science, ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. It's one of the most important tools available for mitigating against the negative effect of climate change and can have a significant influence on carbon budgets. It's for this reason that ecological restoration practices and initiatives have increased over recent years. In the face of ever-increasing destruction and degradation of ecosystems and landscapes worldwide, there is a critical and growing need for ecological restoration to maintain both biodiversity and the quality and the quantity of ecosystem services. CBD set a target to reestablish at least 15% of the world's degraded ecosystem by 2020. It's unlikely that these targets have been met. However, there is a need to set more ambitious objectives. In addition, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity coalition listed ecological restoration as one of the main priorities for all societies across the globe. The success or failure of a restoration program is dependent on several temporal and spatial factors and must fit with society's political, socioeconomic, and cultural context. An important factor that is a key to an effective restoration project is the suitability of the selected sites. For instance, if the environmental conditions are not ideal, this can lead to the failure of rehabilitation of the habitats developed by humans. And to prevent such failures, it's crucial that we develop and test methods for identifying candidate sites for habitat restoration. In order for an ecological restoration project to be as effective as possible, the Botanic Garden Restoration Alliance requires a botanical garden to use qualified expertise and equipment in combination with a clear vision. They provide knowledge and expertise in plant taxonomy, horticulture, biodiversity, inventory, conservation biology, restoration ecology, and ethnobotany, all key elements for achieving successful restoration. In locations that are experiencing considerable degradation, it's important to establish new botanical gardens, as in the case in the Middle East region. The Royal Botanic Garden of Jordan was founded to conserve the plant native to Jordan and to act as center for ecological preservation and restoration initiatives. Although there have been many smaller surveys and programs in parts of Jordan, no ecological restoration program has been implemented at the country level so far. Preserving its remaining natural resources represents a crucial task for Jordan. And important information that can help to achieve this objective can be obtained through the use of species distribution modeling and the development of predictive maps. The present state of vegetation cover must be understood in order to advise and implement vegetation restoration and conservation initiatives. The vast majority of Jordan's area is desert. Very high temperatures, strong wind, intense sunshine, low soil fertility, and low rainfall result desert being particularly fragile environments. Thus, any natural recovery tends to be very protracted, particularly following any kind of disturbance. And it's rare for any opportunity to arise for plant reestablishment. And subsequently, it could take centuries for full recovery to occur without active intervention of a human. It's essential to develop a deeper understanding of natural successional process and the impact that disturbance have on vegetation and plants cover, so that the most appropriate intervention can be determined and implemented for habitat restoration. CBD has been ratified in Jordan, and the country was committed to meeting the target outlined in the global strategy for plant conservation. The objective of my study, which was conducted in cooperation between the University of Edinburgh and the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh and the Royal Botanical Garden in Jordan, is to model both the current and potential vegetation in Jordan in order to help develop appropriate ecological restoration programs in the country. To fulfill this objective, data sets were collected from sampling plots in various habitats and vegetation types and from satellite images. Then the data were analyzed and interpreted using different state-of-the-art techniques and software. And this study is divided into three main phases. Phase 1, to produce an updated map of vegetation cover. Phase 2, modeling potential natural vegetation of Jordan. And the last phase, finding relationship between present and potential vegetation types and its role in identifying priorities for ecological restoration in Jordan. In the phase 1, the objective was to address the following questions. What are the present-day vegetation types in Jordan and where are they found? Firstly, illumination approach between on-the-ground sampling and satellite imagery was employed to define the types of vegetation with datasets obtained from cloud-free Sentinel-2 images. Sentinel remote sensing and GIS software were used to drive a land cover map from high-resolution images based on spectral characteristics of main vegetation types as verified from the ground data. And extensive field experience supported and a supervised classification process and the interpretation of satellite images to translate spectral characteristics into vegetation types. As a result of this study, 3 important maps have been produced for use in land use planning process. These maps are updated land use and land cover map and accurate vegetation map and updated map of phytogeographical area. This study enabled us to produce an updated land use land cover map for use in the classifying vegetation types with high accuracy. Also, 3 vegetation types that were added during this study, namely runoff hamada vegetation, sandy gravel hamada vegetation with Halixilon scubaria, and sandy gravel hamada vegetation with Bachellia gerardi and Artemisia judaica. For the first time, accurate figures were provided about the area of vegetation type, especially for forest, where there was always discrepancy in the estimated area of the area of the forest. Vegetation map gave accurate figure about pine forests, where Ministry of Agriculture report an area greater than actual area, but this is because they have tendency to also include cultivated pine forests in their estimation. 68 riparian vegetation sites were able to be identified from satellite image. These are where the most fragile habitats are located in the country. Also, this study enabled us to accurately define boundaries of the phytogeographical area that intersect in Jordan. All of the previous 3 maps provided a clear picture of the location of the vegetation type in Jordan. They were relied upon to prepare lists of indicator species that were later modeled to produce predictive maps. And based on additional information collected during field work, degradation map was made to illustrate the spatial distribution of human threats to vegetation and its level of impact on habitats. In this study, the factors that threaten the vegetation cover were examined. Some threats were linked to certain vegetation type, but all of these threats cause a degradation of a plant habitat in one way or another. And degradation was measured using a developed index. For this, both quantitative and qualitative data were gathered to the amount of habitat degradation found in this study. And degradation extent is expressed as percentage of the area affected by the type of degradation in the target zone from 0 to 5, where 0 is lowest value and 5 is the highest value, whereas degradation intensity or severity stage is defined as at 5 different levels, and the threshold related to potential of land restoration according to each type of degradation. Also from 5 to 0, where 5 is the lowest potential and 0 is the highest potential. In the second phase of this study, the objective was to address the following question. What is the projected effect of climate change on the distribution of vegetation types studied, measured by suitable habitat area change? Species distribution modeling was used to predict potential natural vegetation in the present day and in the future. And relevant data, including indicator species occurrence, climate data, and topographic data, were selected and analyzed using a presence-only distribution model implemented in the Maxting software. This enabled us the prediction of the present day potential distribution of vegetation types. And to protect future potential distribution of vegetation, 5 future climate models were used with the 3 different carbon emission scenarios for 2 time periods from 2040 to 2060 and from 2080 to 2100. In the last phase of the research, the objective was to address the following question: where restoration initiatives should take place. In this stage, we compared the current vegetation maps with the potential maps in order to create sensitivity maps, with the aim being to identify the most suitable location for carrying out ecological restoration programs. If any environmental condition become unstable, plant species must either move or adapt to the new condition. And as a result of matching potential present day distribution with the future potential distribution, we were able to know the areas in which the distribution of vegetation types changed, and also the area in which the vegetation type was adapted to climate change. The sensitivity map that was produced was used to evaluate the predicted impact of climate change on vegetation types. The grid of future potential distribution area was subtracted of the current potential distribution for each vegetation type, and resulting in 3 possible situations for each cell. The first one, high impact area, where a vegetation type potentially occur in the present climate, but will not be suitable anymore in the future. Low impact areas, where the vegetation type can potentially occur in both present and the future climate conditions. New suitable area, where a vegetation type could potentially occur in the future, but are not suitable for natural occurrence under current conditions. Result of species distribution model were used to identify area where climate change likely will have little or no impact on vegetation type. By the way, these areas are the most appropriate location for ecological restoration. And this research involves selecting locations for restoration that have not yet experienced a permanent deterioration or degradation. So we excluded urban area and dams location. So this map shows area with low impact of climate change, with excluding location of dams and urban where irreversible restoration can take place. To prioritize conservation area, a degradation map was used in order to target the most threatened area. And the degradation index or threats map was overlaid onto potential natural vegetation map for both current and projected potential natural vegetation. Many restoration projects focus on single keystone species, such as rare species or endangered species. Yet sometimes the restoration of degraded habitats need to include entire plant communities. And this estimation of projected suitable future habitat can then be used to help make decisions regarding restoration initiatives. In recent time, species distribution models have been used to enhance the chance of successful restoration project by identifying suitable habitat for particular species for both the present day and the future. In this study, and within the low impact area of climate change, we choose to prioritize areas with high anthropogenic threat, as these are areas support growth the most endangered plant species. As a result of matching the suitable area for ecological restoration with the degradation map that contained 3 levels, ecological restoration was prioritized on 3 different degrees: low, medium, and high priority.
Mr. Hatem, I just want to give you a 2 minutes notice.
Yeah. So at the end, we obtained three maps with 3 different levels of priority to establish or to conduct ecological restoration. The first one, and as a result of matching the map with low level degradation with map of suitable area for ecological restoration, distribution map of low priority ecological restoration area were used, and the second map with moderate priority, and the third map with high priority area. As you see, riparian habitat and thermophilous plants in Jordan Valley are listed in the most priority area to conduct restoration program in that area. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hatem, for that, and for finishing on time there with the 2-minute window that I was provided. I think, I mean, the moment you said data and maps and you said satellite images, I can just imagine how much you've had to do in terms of collection. So it'll be great to see how long you did the study and how much collection that involved, whether it was just drones or it was, you know, publicly available satellite images, or even something that was custom requests that you had to put in. I'll be interested in hearing that later. Maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. I think Jordan is just an amazing place. They have one of the most amazing taglines for tourism, extraordinary. What a way to kind of take a word and just, you know, play on that word. Now we want to move on to our next speaker, and this is Ms. Aisha Farouk, who is working on the Millennium Seed Bank partnerships at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and she'll be speaking about how Botanic Garden seed banks can support restoration and recovery of natural habitats. The floor is yours, Ms. Farouk.
Thank you, Sulaiman. Can everybody hear me and see my screen? Yeah?
Yes, it's clear, Aisha. Go ahead.
Very good. Thank you.
Yes,
Assalamu alaikum to everyone and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me and having this presentation at this webinar. My name is Aisha, and today I will talk about how Botanic Garden seed banks can support restoration and recovery of natural habitats. So we are currently living in a time of unprecedented change. In the past 50 years, the human population has doubled while the global economy has quadrupled. And as a result, 75% of our land surface has been altered and also has led to increase in the rate of biodiversity loss. In relation to plants, this has resulted in about 40% of plant species being threatened with extinction. So botanical gardens have a long history of conserving plant diversity through their living collections, and these are generally raised from material collected from the wild and often include threatened species. With increased focus of plant conservation provided under the framework of the GSPC, the number of botanic gardens working in conservation has greatly increased, which has been touched on brilliantly by Peter in his talk earlier. This is understandable as together with their collections, Botanical Gardens have contributed a unique set of skills and resources to delivering the GSBC targets, including plant identification, plant collection and production, direct management of species, and also research and public engagement. Alongside the living collections, many botanical gardens also manage seed banks. In the last 20 years, we've seen the number of seed banks in botanic gardens doubled, and now the botanic garden community has one of the largest and most sophisticated seed banks in the world. Collectively, seed bank accessions now represent about 67,000 taxa and at least 100,000 accession held over 80 institutions. Here's a kind of league table showing the top 10 of botanic gardens seed banks found globally. And as Paul mentioned, most are within the global north. The Millennium Seed Bank currently dominates the league table with about 40,000 species conserved, but there are also others, for example, the Germplasm Seed Bank of wild species located in the Kunming Institute of Botany in China, which presently conserves around 11,000 species. While the scale of seed bank, the size and the diversity of accessions they hold may vary, the purpose essentially remains the same: to preserve high quality, viable germplasm until required for use. The two seed banks you see here are both developed by Kew. From the mini seed bank, you can see at the top for home use, essentially, all the way to the £20 million investment on the bottom right that's currently nestled in the south of England. And between these two, we have a range of different ones globally, from ones that are built essentially self-built to the ones that are being converted from existing infrastructure. So the Millennium Seed Bank project was initiated during the start of the millennia with a broad aim of conserving seed-bearing plants of the world. Eventually, the MSB became the MSBP, the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership, a global seed conservation partnership active in 97 countries and territories. The typical model is that original collections are kept in country and partners are able to choose to duplicate said collections to the MSB. As the science and practice of ecological restoration have grown, so has the call to expand the capacity of seed banks to provide scientifically robust and practical solutions to seed-related problems linked to restoration. In order for this to do so, the collections within seed banks need to be large and, as Paul mentioned, also genetically diverse. Ex situ collections have the potential of adding diversity back into the wild, which is why there is an increased emphasis on making multiple origin collections that capture and conserve genetic diversity both within and between populations. In addition to this, it is highly important that each are legally acquired, accurately identified, and have a population large enough to permit effective collection without compromising the overall population. To this effect, the collections within the MSBP are guided by the MSBP's Seed Conservation Standard, which provides a framework for high-quality seed collections and conservation. Other guidance are also available, such as the ENSCA-based ENSCANet seed collection guidelines and also the Australian germplasm guidelines as well. An initiative within the MSBP that emphasizes diversity through its collection is the UK Native Tree Seed Project. The project employs a rigorous sampling strategy which aims to conserve a genetically representative collection of native woody species. Effectively, the UK was split into distinct seed zones and each species was sampled from at least one population from each zone. Additionally, collections from each individual maternal tree were kept as separate accessions. And in a study in 2019, looking at the allelic frequency within maternal population of taxa, Taxus baccata, the authors actually showed that 86% of the alleles present within the population was also present within the UK Native Tree Seed Project collection. It concluded that the number of trees sampled was more important than the number of seeds collected per tree.
Aisha, if I may just, I know we're trying to also fit it within the time, but just to give yes, I'm saying if we can just slow it down a little bit for our interpreters.
Okay, yes, I will do. Sorry. Sorry about that. Okay, I will try and slow things down. Okay, so right, I've spoken about the National Tree Seed Project. This is scaling this up, essentially scaling it up to the global level, is the Adapting Agriculture to Climate Change Project, or the Crop Wild Relatives Project for short. This is a project led by the Global Crop Diversity Trust, and it was in partnership with the MSBP. This project aims to contribute towards food security through the conservation of genetically diverse collections of wild relatives of crops, and it focused on 28 major crops covered under the International Treaty of Plant Genetic Resources. It included 25 different partners from our global partnership from 4 different continents, many of whom were actually Botanic Gardens. So what was clear from the start of the program was the asset that the Botanic Gardens community had, particularly associated with their seed bank, the wealth of knowledge that was available from the Botanic Gardens in relation to taxonomy and locality of species and populations, allowed the development of kind of these guide maps and identified areas that needed to be bridged in order to capture maximum diversity between different populations for species. Over 4,000 seed collections were made from over 300 different species or subspecies. Although this program was not strictly related to restoration, the global collection that captured multiple populations across different environmental gradients gives us a unique opportunity of identifying collections that have local adaptation to a particular climate. For example, this is a map showing the collection of wild carrots that we have in the Millennium Seed Bank across a gradient of heat tolerances. So while the diversity and quality of seed is critical, the value of seed collection is only further enhanced through its accessibility. For seed stores within the MSB, small samples are available free of charge for non-commercial purposes via our MSB seed list. Efforts are also underway to enhance the access of data recorded during the ongoing curation of collections. For example, Paul has already showed us the seed information database, which allows users to look at biological seed data and germination protocols. This will make it easier for practitioners to know how to germinate and eventually grow their particular species. For partners that are within the MSBP, the data warehouse gives access to information of and data from seed holdings from across the partnership, including those that are not directly duplicated to the MSB. So alongside providing seed, Botanic Garden seed banks can also provide the associated expertise in seed processing, storage, and use, making a broader range of biological material available to practitioners. Ex situ collections held at Botanic Garden seed banks can greatly contribute towards the recovery of species or habitats, particularly after major environmental disasters. In 2019, Australia suffered the worst bushfire season, seeing 24 million hectares of its land burnt and countless species lost or severely impacted. Cudley Creek near Adelaide is home to several rare and threatened plant species, but is also a region that was left devastated by the fires. The South Australian Seed Conservation Centre, a partner of the MSBP, is working to restore the area. And part of the program is to restore population of Glycine latrivina, a threatened pea endemic to the region. And back in 2007, over 1,000 seeds of clover glycine were collected from the Mount Lofty range for long-term storage at MSB. In 2020, 250 seeds from this collection, along with its germination protocol, were sent to Australia. And since then, partners have reported that 90% of the seeds sent actually germinated and now are being used for further propagation work. In other cases, new collecting efforts are needed to respond to local environmental and livelihood needs. The Great Green Wall project aims to build a restoration model that would generate environmental and socio-economic benefits to the Sahel region. And the MSBP played an essential role in this framework by providing partners with scientific and technical expertise in plant identification, seed conservation, seed biology, and ecological research. Similarly, in Kenya, together with the Brackenhurst Botanic Garden, field trials of key framework species were developed to compare the performance of native species and identify appropriate species for use in national restoration initiatives. This project resulted in a list of high-performing species native to a particular area, which can be adopted into landscape-level restoration programs. The team then went ahead to analyze the availability of seeds from the Kenyan Forestry Seed Catalogue, and unfortunately found that 50% of the species were either not available or not viably tested. It is therefore an opportunity here for Botanic Garden seed banks to contribute towards closing this bottleneck of seed supply. Seed supply issues are also present within the UK. And while single species collections held at the MSBP, although small by commercial standards, have proved large enough to create bespoke mixtures for small scale habitat restoration, or supplement kind of bigger bulk harvested materials to create species rich mixtures. The UK Native the UK Native Seed Hub was established in 2011 and uses the seed collections and associated expertise to increase the quantity, quality, and diversity of native plant material available to practitioners in the UK. It has generated over 50 collections of more than 40 species and focused on material that would not be available from any other source. So things that are very rare, difficult to propagate or germinate. So in summary, seed collections held in Botanic Gardens offer a huge long-term opportunity for recovery and restoration. There are, however, key challenges that needs to be addressed, which will hopefully lead to some future opportunities for the Botanic Garden community. Firstly, there are gaps in the collection, in the knowledge, and in the investment. It is apparent that ex situ collections and conservation expertise continue to sit outside the countries with the greatest plant diversity, and ironically, in the most urgent need for restoration. It is, however, encouraging to see that the situation is changing, particularly from Paul's talk earlier, but more needs to be done. Quality control must continue to be addressed and improved. While the number of standards and guidelines have been published, it is not really clear to what extent these standards are being followed and how much seed held in Botanic Gardens are in fact viable. Availability of funding at a scale needed to conserve and restore plant diversity is severely lacking, and investment in collecting activities that aim to generate representative collections can be a significant barrier to many Botanic Garden seed banks. Enhancing access to and supply of materials continue to be a major constraint in restoration activities worldwide. Projects aiming at tackling specific regions for this, alongside training and resources availability to enhance the supply chain within nations, is desperately needed. And many of the above challenges that I've mentioned in some way could be mitigated through the development and maintenance of networks, not only between Botanic Gardens, but also incorporating other practitioners and local communities working towards the conservation and restoration of a given species or habitat. Examples like the Ecological Restoration Alliance led by BGCI, which I think we'll hear about later, represents one such network that would greatly contribute towards global restoration targets. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Aisha Farouk. I think you did a great job of slowing down for the interpreters, but not slowing down too much. So I'm sure they're in your debt for doing that. So the next speaker is also from the Missouri Botanical Garden, and he will be speaking about optimizing living collections to support plant conservation. And I will, I gladly give the floor to Mr. Andrew Wyatt. The floor is yours, sir. Andrew, can you hear it?
Andrew, you are muted. Can you please unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Please, the floor is yours.
So I'm honored to speak to the conference today, and thank you very much for the invite. I'm going to bring this down to a little bit more of a practical level on how we are looking at developing collections at the Missouri Botanical Garden to support some of the things that we've been talking about today. You know, how do we really increase capacity around species level conservation and genetic conservation in a way that allows us to actually make the collections viable for restoration projects. And I think efficiency is very, very important here. And you can see from this slide, lots of speakers have mentioned numbers about threatened plants. I'm going with a high range of about 140,000 plant species under threat of extinction. And on the right-hand side of the slide here, you can see all of that a snapshot of some of that wonderful diversity of plant species that are under threat. And some of the challenges that we have really are bringing these processes down to very practical levels in botanical gardens, in being able to implement conservation of species and conservation of the genetics as well. So only a fraction of staff in botanic gardens are really currently involved in conservation compared to what could potentially be. And we've seen the number of about 30% of the flora held in botanic gardens. But that doesn't mean we're holding the genetic representation of that flora effectively in those collections either. So we've got some work to do on bridging that gap between species collections and the genetic diversity of those species collections. And we really have to really integrate the in situ and ex situ conservation to a larger degree as well to support species extinction, and then deliver that to into restoration to support on the ground conservation projects. And I think we have in botanic gardens a pressure between visitor attraction and also the conservation and science as well, which I'll address a little bit later in the presentation. And the way in which we develop collections also needs to change so that we can actually build the capacity of collections development in botanic gardens. So botanic gardens can do lots of different types of conservation with their living collections. And where we really want to be is down in this area with the mass genetic diverse collections and species extinction prevention. And some of the efforts that Missouri Botanic Garden has taken over the last few years have really increased our rare species holdings. And we've seen an increase of about 650% of rare species represented in the living collections. And this comes from our efforts of centralizing and making the process of conservation and building conservation collections everybody's job at the Botanical Garden, and particularly down to our horticulturist level and then all the way up to our curator levels in horticulture. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those processes that we use to do that throughout our horticulture division. Now you can see on the slide here on the left-hand side, it's a very simplified set of goals associated to Missouri Botanic Gardens collections. And this is great. And we can put this into policy, and we can put numbers on these things. We can put numbers of species of conservation concern, lofty goals of we want 75% of the world's flora conserved. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to people and process and everyday choices about what we bring into collections, the quality of our accessions, the ability to track and record data, and the choices that we make on those species and the distribution of collections across those species. And so we have to understand that it can't just be about policy and general guidelines. It has to be activated on the ground in a very, very practical way, involving all staff in the Botanic Garden to be able to push and drive this drive this forward to develop effective conservation collections. So with that in mind, the Missouri Botanic Garden has 3 legs to its living collection, and they are inseparable. We view the seed bank, the growing plants in the collection, and the in vitro collections as one unit. And that is very important for us because as we get incoming species, we can decide where to put those. As we field collect for species for our living collections on the grounds, we're also collecting viable numbers for seed banking as well wherever possible. And so we're using the combined strength of those 3 areas of our collection interchangeably on any given species that comes in, but integrated together. And that's really important because even viability testing in seed banks doesn't mean that you can actually grow that species and bring it to a living specimen growing on the ground. And so you have to combine the conservation horticulture aspect with the seed banking and the micropropagation as an integrated unit to be able to deliver that conservation effectively. And so paradigm number 1 is that we really do see those as linked together. Of course, the seed bank, in our case, we can't hold the genetic diversity of every tree species. And so that mass genetic storage is very, very important to us. But equally, that quality level of being able to grow those species, and if we're dealing with ultra rare species, dealing with the numbers of small species and being able to effectively cross those to generate genetic diversity put back in the seed bank is also very important to us as well. So that integration is critical. The second paradigm is that we view the living collection as the whole site. Right, and this goes back to that idea of display versus conservation versus science. You have to look at it from the standpoint of usable space, and our usable space at the garden is the landscapes themselves. And so really the optimum is to make sure that you've got conservation species going out there on display and effectively looking at the collections development as individual species in a landscape. So a lot of folks, a lot of horticulturists look at the landscape and say, well, it's a landscape picture, but it comes down to those individual choices of species that go out there and the genetic representation of those species across the entire site. So you have to think based on the individual garden area, but also on the site-wide, particularly when you're looking at genetics, right? So you may have one species represented in one particular area, but you may have to plant it multiple times with multiple genets across an entire site to capture as much genetic diversity as you can. So planning has to be at the individual level, the staff member responsible for that individual area, and also at that overall level where you're looking at capturing the genetic diversity across the entire site. So the black dots on the map here on the right-hand side are the 19,500 accessions of rare plant species we have in the living collections, and you can see they're spread across the entire landscape of the garden, and that's very, very important to us as well. It requires building effective collections for genetic diversity and wild collections requires horticulturists to think in advance, and it's very difficult sometimes for horticulturists to think like this, right? It's an immediate need to put a plant in the ground to hold up a display. So we have to understand that wild collecting genetically viable material can take 2 to 4 years to get those into the collections. So we have to think in advance, many years in advance in most cases. And so effective planning, backing that effective planning up in thinking about the collections is really, really critical in supporting the genetic diversity in the living collections. So we've really wrestled with how to make it efficient to get collections into the garden at the Missouri Botanic Garden. And some of the challenges that we really face is we're seeing curation type horticulture really not taught in universities anymore. So that's very difficult for us. Traditionally, curators have held the ability to be able to make choices in their individual areas, which we still want to preserve. But that leads to really focused on the species level, but not potentially on the genetic level, right? Because you're looking at the site as a whole. So what we've tried to do is build resources to be able to make those decisions on a site-wide basis. And this is an example of some of our data-driven targeting. And so over the last few years, we've developed a targeting database which takes all of this wonderful biological data in endangered status, whether we've got it alive or dead in the collection, whether it's present in another botanic garden, whether it's assessed on our weed risk assessment, seed storage behavior, duration of the plant, the type of plant. And we've done this across several hubs that we're working on to conserve the species. So we're working in areas like Japan, China, Central Asia, the Caucasus. And so this database has about 240,000 species in it. And it allows our horticulturists to go in and prioritize those species based on species of conservation concern, so that we can then say, let's add these species to the living collection. So of course we're doing that. But I would say that it's important to be able to have those genetic protocols across all species in the collection, and not just the conservation species of conservation concern, because our environment is changing. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. So we need to have genetic representation for all species coming into the collection, and not just prioritized on those species of conservation concern. On the back end of this targeting database, our collections development staff, once a horticulturist has selected a species, our collections development staff then go into action, and they'll say, well, we want to make sure that we targeting for field collecting the amount of genetics that we need for any given species. And so they work up a collections plan for that species. And you can see here on the left-hand side of the slide, the NatureServe points, which here in yellow for Quercus arkansana, and our points of collection from the Missouri Botanic Gardens collections here in blue across the population, so that we can maximize the genetic representation. And so, so our horticulturists choose a species, then we go through a process of actually making sure that when we're field collecting, we're collecting that genetic diversity as well. And sometimes we can get a very quick collection of all of the species in any given for conservation for a given species based on the size of the population. And sometimes it takes many years of picking away at representing that genetic diversity. This is an example of field collecting for good genetic resources. On the right-hand side here, this is some of our work in Kyrgyzstan with 2 different apple species. Malus nidowitsiana is represented in these little yellow points here. And this is the process where we do mother plant tracking, and we actually label these plants in the wild so that we can bring the genetics back into the collections, and then they can go back out there representing the spread of the individuals in the wild back into restoration projects. So we track them with our own individual records, and then every time we go out into the wild, we can actually attribute a collection back to that individual. So that's very important for carrying those genetics through the collection and potentially into restoration projects in the future. On the left-hand side here, you're seeing Malus subversii, which is got thousands of species left versus the 200 for nidowitsiana. And that one, we're just doing representative collections across a species range. This slide a little bit confusing, but it shows that mother plant process by where we're tagging those individual mother plants. We bring that material into the collection, and a single mother plant may have multiple accessions associated to it, but we can tag those back to that individual accession. And then when we put them back out into ex situ conservation, we can make sure that we've got the genetic representation of all of those mother plants going back into those restoration projects effectively to create a breeding population. So the way in which you manage living collections really can enhance the ability to support restoration through the collections management. And when we bring that down to an individual horticulturist level, this is something we actually just developed to tie that targeting database and the goals down to an individual horticulturist level. You can see here, this is what we call a garden area assessments report. And it basically ties the targets associated to conservation to an individual horticulturist in an individual area of the garden. And you can see the targets associated to those. And if we open up these tabs, we can actually see which species this horticulturist, Marielle Trivy here in this case, has actually selected and which ones are of conservation concern and how effective we've been at getting those into the garden's collections. So it's important to bring it down to the individual landscape level. Data is very, very important. Knowledge building is very, very important. So as we build collections from targeting all the way through to field collecting, seed collections protocols, and cultivation protocols, all of this data gets tagged to the individual accession. And that data is very, very important to build a species knowledge report. And so it's key to record the data at the same time and have that data available for sharing to support restoration and conservation. This is an example of some of our propagation protocols here. And we've generated about 4,700 of them over the last 5 years, associated to species coming into the collection. And it's important to make sure that you've got some process to be able to make sure you're doing things in a scientific method to be able to get these good results out of these propagation protocols at the end.
Mr. Wyatt, the 2-minute time alert.
Yes. And then lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that horticulturists can aid in supporting genetics or actually cause problems in cultivation. Of course, horticulturists like to select plants. We like to look at robust plants and cultivar selections. It's important to think in reverse, right? We don't want to create selection through the propagation process. We want to make sure we capture that genetic diversity. We also want to make sure we have labeling effectively across the garden's grounds, and these are key things. We want to make sure we track the location of plants. We don't want to put multiple accessions of the same species together. These seem easy, but they're easy mistakes to make. And you want to make sure that you're taking off seed heads to prevent hybridization. And we stay away from annuals mostly in collections on the grounds because of that genetic bottlenecking effect that can happen. And then we can actually use those collections and manage them effectively to build genetic resources for the seed bank by doing controlled crosses, or we can control crosses by cloning, which is very, very important for some rare species as well. And lastly, I want to make sure that I pass along some ideas. We have to live by our principles. We have to stick to good collections recording, good management of living collections. It would be great if we can share more data associated to wild collected sources across botanic gardens so that we can map that and understand the gaps in where we are. We're still a little bit away from that, and be able to look at distribution points associated to collections on a massive scale across the globe, and also sharing data. So those are things which I think that we've got ability to work on in the future to make it more efficient for us to target living collections. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wyatt. And to be fair to you, I didn't mention it earlier, your role, but as the Senior Vice President of Horticulture and Living Collections at the Missouri Botanical Garden, what I think you did is you just gave us an insider's view on what happens on the ground there at your work. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. I want to give the floor next to Ms. Kirsty Shaw, who is also at the BGCI, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, and she is the head of Ecological Restoration and Tree Conservation. So she's going to be talking about Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens. And the floor is yours, Ms. Kirsty Shaw.
Thank you very much. So yes, I'll be talking about the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens. And as just mentioned, I'm from Botanic Gardens Conservation International, which Paul presented on earlier. It's the world's largest plant conservation network. And the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens is a subgroup of that broader network. So the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens was launched back in 2012, and it's a global consortium of botanic gardens who are actively engaged in ecological restoration. So the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens, or ERA, was launched to recognize that botanic gardens carry out best practice for ecological restoration, but also that botanic gardens have the skills necessary to be delivering well-planned ecological restoration. They adopt a scientific approach as well. So the mission of the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens is to mobilize botanic gardens, arboreta, and seed banks to carry out science-based ecological restoration by marshalling their expertise, networks, and resources to help achieve the restoration outcomes needed for human well-being and a sustainable future for life on Earth. So to have a look at some of the expertise that botanic gardens really can bring to ecological restoration, and we've actually heard about a lot of these from the presenters so far, many of which are members of the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens. So botanic gardens have really strong horticultural expertise, so they can grow the whole range of plants. This is really important for generating a supply of material for ecological restoration. And Botanic Gardens also have their collections. So as we've already heard today, at least 1/3 of flowering plants are maintained in living or seed bank collections. So again, a really important resource for ecological restoration. Botanic Gardens also have training expertise. So they're carrying out a lot of capacity building, training and teaching. So they have the capacity in particular to train others on ecological restoration techniques. And another important aspect is that Botanic Gardens are hubs for public outreach. So we estimate that there are 750 million visitors to the world's Botanic Gardens annually. So this is a really important opportunity for Botanic Gardens to educate their visitors about the need for ecological restoration. So the Ecological Restoration Alliance currently has 50 members, and they're located all around the world. They range from some of the biggest botanic gardens in the world to some of the smallest, some that are just starting to take on a role in ecological restoration, but a really diverse mix of botanic gardens within the Ecological Restoration Alliance at the moment. So one of the key roles of the Ecological Restoration Alliance is to carry out ecological restoration projects, either within their botanic gardens or associated sites, that are important areas for demonstrating best practice for ecological restoration, for trialing different approaches for ecological restoration. And the sites also provide training opportunities as well as outreach opportunities about best practice for ecological restoration. So I'm just going to run through some of the examples of practical projects led by members of the Ecological Restoration Alliance. So starting firstly with Kaduri Farm and Botanic Garden, which is located in Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, there's hardly any primary forest that remains there. And Kaduri Farm and Botanic Garden have been planting hillsides with native and threatened tree species. So they're trialing different techniques, so a combination of direct seeding, as well as using tree guards to shelter the seedlings on the hill from the wind. And they're also carrying out enrichment planting to bring in some of the rare species as well. And this approach has been really successful at Kaduri Farm and Botanic Garden. And this garden is now replicating this restoration work at other sites across Hong Kong. And the next example I want to share is Jardín Botánico de Cartagena Guillermo Piñeres, which is located in the Caribbean region of Colombia. So tropical dry forest is one of Colombia's most endangered ecosystems, and unfortunately there's only about 8% remaining. So this is the area where this botanic garden is working, and they're taking on a leading role in research and study of tropical dry forest. So their real aim here is to reconnect remaining patches of primary dry forest. They're also offering training and bringing other partners on board to scale up this initiative as well. Another member that I'd like to mention is Kings Park and Botanic Garden, who are located in Western Australia. So they're restoring mining sites, but working very much in collaboration with the extractives industry. So again, they're adopting a very scientific approach, and they're carrying out experiments to determine seed behavior, to identify optimum seed treatments to ensure really good germination success. They're also carrying out some seed pelleting experiments, which is really pioneering in this field of work. And again, making sure that this work is replicable and scalable. They're sharing the lessons learned with other partners, both within Western Australia and other parts of the world as well. And another example is from Tura Botanical Gardens, which is located in Western Uganda. And Tura Botanical Gardens holds the most diverse collection of native tree species in Uganda within their arboretum. And they also operate the largest indigenous tree nursery in Uganda as well. So initially, this garden was restoring local and central forest reserves in Western Uganda and providing education and outreach as well from the garden focused on ecological restoration. So more recently, this garden has been scaling up their work by establishing 4 additional community indigenous tree nurseries across Uganda. And these nurseries are located to high priority sites for restoration, as identified by the Uganda Forest Landscape Restoration Opportunities Assessment. And so by establishing these additional nurseries, they've provided employment to more than 100 people, propagated so far more than 130,000 seedlings of more than 100 native species, which is very different to what you see in other tree nurseries across Uganda. Particularly the government nurseries there tend to have a very strong focus on just a few exotic species. So really great to have this diversity of species available from these nurseries. And so far they've brought 130 hectares under restoration by planting this diverse mix of species. So to make sure that the lessons learned from projects from ERA members are shared, ERA develops resources such as a species recovery manual, some species recovery guidance briefs, a book on restoring tropical forests, and all of these resources are freely available from the ERA website, so please do take a look. And as well as that, ERA members are also offering online and in-person training courses as well to really help to scale up best practice ecological restoration. So as we know, global interest in ecological restoration is really increasing at the moment. We can see that urgent solutions are needed to climate change, and restoration is recognized as a key opportunity for mitigating climate change impact. So we now see that restoration is called for in the targets of international conventions, as well as in national targets. And we're also seeing ambitious tree planting initiatives being launched to sequester enormous quantities of carbon and huge pledges being made. So these pledges and these large-scale approaches provide an exciting opportunity or potential opportunity for biodiversity conservation, as well as at the same time as capturing carbon and potentially providing huge benefits to huge livelihood benefits to local people as well. But unfortunately, a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is planting of exotic species or planting of a small mix of native species. In some cases, planting invasive species that are actually degrading native biodiversity rather than restoring and improving it. So this is of concern to the botanical community, particularly members of the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens. And so we've been focusing currently on putting measures in place to really try and improve the biodiversity outcomes of ecological restoration and encouraging other organisations to really adopt a more similar approach to the approach that's delivered by members of the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens. So I'll just run through some of the things that we've been putting in place. And in early 2021, many authors from the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens, plus other authors, produced the 10 Golden Rules for Reforestation. The Royal Botanic Gardens Kew was the lead on this publication. And the 10 Golden Rules include things like working together, making it pay, learning by doing. And this publication really points out the most important things that you need to consider to achieve strong outcomes for people, for biodiversity, and for carbon capture from reforestation. And what we're really pleased about here is that these 10 Golden Rules have been adopted by tree planting organisations around the world. And so they're really taking these on board and making sure that the projects that they deliver really stick to these 10 Golden Rules. Again, in early 2021, in February, we held a joint conference by BGCI and the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, again focused on reforestation, focusing on reforestation for biodiversity, carbon capture, and livelihoods at the same time. So in this conference, we showcased examples of best practice. So many of them were from members of the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens. And in the conference, it was a really important opportunity to hold some discussions on best practices, how we can try to improve native seed supply, for example. And all of these sessions are freely available, and I've got the link there on this slide. So as a result of that conference, we launched the Kew Declaration, which calls for stronger biodiversity considerations in tree planting programs. It also calls for policymakers and financiers of reforestation to support science-based and well-planned restoration. And very importantly, it also calls for no planting of invasive species. So this declaration was made publicly available for signature, and over 3,000 global experts and concerned citizens from 114 countries signed the declaration, which was recently published with those signatures included. So again, we're really pleased with the amount of recognition that this declaration got from around the world. Then more recently, just at COP26, we announced the development of the Global Biodiversity Standard. And this seeks to halt the biodiversity crisis by recognizing initiatives that protect, restore, and enhance biodiversity, rather than initiatives that are accelerating its decline. So the standard is currently being developed by the global botanical community. We've got some early backers on board, including Ecosia, the tree planting search engine, Plan Vivo, OneT.org, and Etihad Airways. And this methodology is based on the 10 golden rules for reforestation. And so sites are assessed on their biodiversity impact, and the assessment involves both remote sensing and site visits by members of the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens and other botanical experts to really verify what's happening on the ground. And the standard includes both a certification approach and also a mentoring approach, making sure that the skills of Botanic Gardens can be shared to build up capacity of other organisations carrying out restoration as well. So really looking to improve the biodiversity outcomes of ecological restoration through these approaches. So we've just put a new strategy in place for the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens from 2021 to 2025. So that first goal is about really implementing the Global Biodiversity Standard. We also have a goal to build ecological restoration capacity. So looking at building capacity in local communities, academia, industry, government, NGOs, and other international bodies. Our third goal is to continue to work with partners to set up and maintain these long-term restoration projects that, as I mentioned, provide opportunities for demonstrating best practice as well as delivering training. And we also are looking to build recognition of the value of involving botanical organizations and botanical expertise in ecological restoration.
Kirsty, just a 2 minutes.
So this is my last slide, so we're doing okay. Yeah, so we know that this is a really important time for ecological restoration. And whilst we are concerned about some of the approaches that we're seeing around the world, we do know that the botanical community has got a lot to offer to ecological restoration. Some really great examples of best practice within the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens. And we're also really excited about the initiatives that the Ecological Restoration Alliance members are putting in place at the moment. So if you're interested in finding out more, or you want to join the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens, please do get in touch. So our website is erabg.org, or you can email me at kirsty.shaw@bgci.org. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you in this conference today.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. I mean, that was really, really insightful. And I also learned a lot, and the resources are also very useful, especially when you kind of tied it in with what just happened at the COP26, that there's something currently being developed. But I also get excited whenever I hear the word alliance, because you really, I mean, for this kind of effort, we need all hands on deck. And I heard this saying recently that said, if we want to run fast, we run alone. If we want to run far, we run together. So thank you very much for that, Kirsty. Our next speaker is Mr. Ahmed Al-Kharib from the Botanic Garden here at Qatar Foundation. And he is the plant ecologist there, and someone that I know personally, and I learn a lot as a mentor and an older brother. And he will be speaking about rehabilitation of desert trees and restoration of arid ecosystems. The floor is yours, Mr. Ahmed Al-Kharib.
Thank you, Suleiman, and thanks for everybody for attending the webinar. Thank you so much. They gave very comprehensive lectures. Today, I will talk about the rehabilitation of the desert trees and restoration of the arid ecosystem. As you see, most of the case studies, they are talking about reforestation, but we are coming from different area of the world. So we are coming from the desert, so we'll talk about the desert. And try to remember this this photo on the right, because I will remind you with this later on. So as you see, we are located in the desert, in the very hyper arid region. So we'll try to see to discover what is going on and how we can do the the restoration, or apply the restoration, ecosystem restoration efforts in this kind of areas. So our headline today, so we'll talk about the Arabian arid ecosystem challenges, where most of the people talk about the challenge and species extincts. And also we'll talk about the restoration program in the Quranic Botanic Garden KBG, and the vegetation mapping projects and evaluation study that we are running in the Quranic Botanic Garden here in Qatar, and the rewilding projects based on the restoration, which we are aiming to bring back the wildlife to nature again, and the soil bank study that Isha mentioned, and she talked about the seed bank, but here we'll talk about the soil seed bank as a part of the ecosystem restoration here in the area. So first, we'll talk about the Arabian arid ecosystem challenge. As you see in this red area, we are located in this red zone, which is the arid region. What does it mean? Here that we are receiving a very little amount of the rains. So in this area, you can imagine that all of this areas that the red one receives less than 100 millimeter of rains per square meter. It means a very small can of Pepsi of rain in this area. So you can imagine that area, the scarcity of the vegetation, and the better that is this vegetation can be scattered, and also is not like a forest dense vegetation, but sometimes in some specific kind of habitats they are grown very dense, and we are focusing on those kind of habitats, what's called roda. About 25% of the land has been degraded because of the urban use, and because of the infrastructure and desertification. As you see in this lecture, most of the vegetation has been lost because of the many of factors. The main factor is the human impact and the human effect. As you see here, most of the human effect here in the Arabian area and the desert focused on the infrastructure, unplanned infrastructure, and also the camping and the grazing area. As you see in this picture, there's massive grazing area. So this plant is Lycium shawiai, which is completely eaten by camels and by goats and sheep here. And also this is the massive impact of grazing lead there is no any ground cover around the shrub. This is the wooden shrub, but there is no any ground cover around this plant. So most of the animals and the perennials are completely disappeared because of the grazing effect. And also the camping in this area, it has been the land use used as camping. So most of the people are camping, so they are left their garbage. And also sometimes they are using irregular tracks, car tracks. So the trampling effect has destroyed all the juveniles and the ground cover of the plants. So this most of the this is the human impacts, which is the negative impact for the vegetation. That's why we need to take an action. In this year, 2021, the UN United Nations dedicates ecosystem restoration decade for the United Nations, which is assessing to recover the ecosystem that have been degraded or destroyed, as well as the ecosystem that's still intact. And not only the destroyed ecosystem should be protected, but also we should preserve the current, which is still intact. So we'll talk today about the in situ conservation project. In the Quranic Botanic Garden, we had 2 programs actually for conservation, which is ex situ conservation, which we have the seed bank. We had a good seed bank that conserves all the plants mentioned in the Quran, the Hadith, and also all the flora of Qatar. We almost had more than 200 collections, plant species with 300 collections, and also we had the herbarium, which is collecting all the flora of Qatar as well as the plants of the Quranic Botanic Garden. And also we had the propagation, all of the propagation or the nursery or the arboretum of the Quranic Botanic Garden, which is all of those as a part of the Botanic Conservation Center. This is for the ex situ conservation, but today we'll talk about the in situ conservation, which is growing outside in the natural habitats. So we'll talk about the habitat assessment and vegetation mapping project, and how we study the vegetation and do analysis for the vegetation flora and of Qatar, and also the rehabilitation of the desert plants and the restoration program, especially in Rawdat ecosystem, and what is the effect of this restoration on the wildlife, especially the small mammals. We are studying right now the Arabian desert hare. The last study that we are recently doing right now is the soil seed bank, and what is the effect of the human impact in the soil seed bank, and how we can study the seeds in the soil. So our vegetation mapping and habitat assessment, this in this shape, this is the Rawda or Rawdat or the depression. Rawdat, it means depression in English, Rawda in Arabic. And this depression, Qatar main habitat are considered like a desert stone in the desert habitats. But inside the desert stone, there is a kind of depression which contains sediments and deposits. These deposits contain the joy and dense vegetation. That's why this is called Rawda. And Rawda, it means like a garden in Arabic. So the main Rawda, it means the place of joy and dense vegetation. This is the meaning of Arabic. And in habitat, it means the depression which contains all the sediments, and it is surrounded by elevated land which is called hazm. So it receives all the rains, all the rains go through this depression and runnel. That's why the vegetation are become dense. Here, how we study and we do the assessment in the Quranic Botanic Garden. So we start from the data collection. So what kind of data that we are collected in order to do this kind of assessment? So we are collecting the locality and the GPS coordinates. All of this we are trying to link this kind of data with the global assessment, and also the IUCN red listing. So we are collecting the GPS coordinates, we are collecting the microhabitats and the soil description. This is a very important to the data to be collected. Also the vegetation state, the seasonality, this plant flowering, fruiting, dormant. So we have here dormant, vegetative, flowering, and the fruiting. This is the seasonality, and also threats could affect the which is grazing, collection, camping, fuel, urbanization, or any kind of threats, and we give rank. Hatem mentioned that he's doing threats and give a ranker from 0 to 10. Here we are giving low, medium, high, and then this is the qualitative data, and then we will convert into quantitative and numbers. Also, we are collecting the plant association, what is the associated plants, and number of individuals, what is the plant state for the plant, and also the threats. We are collecting the threats for the locations, and also the threats that affect the plant itself, if noticed. And then most important to collect the height and number of individuals and the width of the plant in order to calculate the cover and the correlations of the plants with the habitats. This part of our database. So this is the outcomes or the outputs that we are looking. So all of this is one sheet that we are collecting the GPS coordinates and then convert this into all numbers. So this is how we entering the data in order to be analyzed. Also, it has been mentioned many programs for analysis like GIS and Maxent, as Hatim mentioned, that to do layering, we will use this kind of programs in order to do layering. But we are right now in the very beginning of the project, so we are collecting data and we will represent some vegetation mapping that we already did. So this is the database that we are. From this, we are getting the correlation between the species and the threats and microhabitats, and also the updated rarity and the conservation status. The term rare right now, this plant is rare, as commonly used. So we will try here to educate people what is the term rare, based on the measurements and based on real conservation. This will help the restoration. In this one, in this slide, you may say that this is the road at Al-Faras, the restoration site. So we start with to study the capacity building, as Paul mentioned, that capacity building for the site is very important. So we are studying the capacity for the sites. So there are 5 different microhabitats has been recorded here: sand accumulation, the runnel, the shallow depressions, and also the sandy desert and stony desert. So, but here, because of the human impact, if you show to this graph, you will not see at all any annuals or perennials. The green columns here, all of them are shrubs or trees. Only they still survive, but most of the perennial herb and or prostrate shrublet or perennial grass are here disappeared because of the massive grazing. In order to take an action, we should do a comparison between this site and another site. So we're talking about nearby site, maybe 1 kilo difference between this site and that site. So this is La Qur'an site. You may difference this big circles, that it means that this is a species richness. If we go back, you will see that most are small circles. It means that species richness here is very low, but in the other side, which is here La Qur'an, which not far from this one is big circle. It means that here the species richness here is high because of the side road runnels. This kind of habitat, the grazing here are prohibited because it's very close to the highway. So here in the area, the grazing are prohibited, and this area is close to any road. Many of the species here are more viable, and you can record more than different kind of habits and life form of the plants, like perennial grass, or perennial herb or annual herb, because of the grazing here are prohibited. There is a grazing, but not like inside this area, the green, inside the desert. Here most of the vegetation are desert, small shrubs or shrubs. That's why we know right now that the missing what is the species are growing nearby the area. So we are working in our nurseries to again regenerate and replant those kind of species from the seed bank, and do germination experiments in order to produce those plants and return it back again to their habitats, natural habitats. Here, as you see, this is the massive grazing. As I told you, there is no any ground cover or grass, though they make our life difficult. So as you see, also here the density of the vegetation is very low. Acacia rembingiana, for example, you will not find less than one individual per 100 square meter. And also here, if you go back for Josephus pneumonia's 1.3 individual for 100 square meter is very less amount of value. Sorry, and also.
Just want to give you a time alert, inshallah, okay?
Okay, thank you, Suleiman. This is the first project, and this is the individual. Only 10 species has been recorded in this project, and this is the restoration project of the Quran Botanic Garden. So we start to return the species again to their natural habitat. So we select two sites, one inside Road al-Faras, which is inside desert area, and another site inside the education city, Qatar Foundation. This is the urban, one of the urban area inside the urban area, and one inside the desert urban area. So we are following the Qatar construction specification QCS. It means when we dig the holes, we dig 2 meter to 1 meter depth by 1 meter width, and then we remove the soil, and it has been this is with alluvial soil, but here we are using the subsurface irrigation and very superficial digging for the site, and we are putting the site under water stress in the desert, of course. We can imagine that the species that have been restored in the desert, the growth rate is very low, slow, but the growth rate of the same species in the urban areas is very fast. Look at the Josephus pneumoniae, for example. The basal area is 0.116 meter for Josephus pneumoniae, while in the urban area is 1.4 meter. So maybe 4 times bigger than the restoration area. But here the irrigation rate for the urban site inside the QF location is 24.5 liter a day, but the irrigation rate for the desert area is 22 liters a week. You imagine the 22 liters a week and still able to survive in a temperature more than 40 degrees and 45 degrees. We noticed that there is many of weeds growing in the alluvial soil in the area of the restored and Qatar Foundation in the urban area. That's why we are studying the weeds association with the plant, and from this area, why the plants in the other area in the desert, they didn't give any kind of plants. However, we are giving water. That's why we are doing another kind of a study, which is the effect of this is the soil seed bank study. So we are assuming the scratching of land could be effective, that we are doing replicas, giving water with a scratch, and then another quadrant with water without scratch, and scratch without water, and no water, no scratch. We are trying to see what is growing here inside this kind of habitats. So we have different kind of 5 replicas inside, and we are fixing sensors, moisture sensor, in order to see what is going on when we give water, and we are looking for the rain in order to see. So we started this last month, the soil seed bank study, in order to study the ground seeds and what will grow inside while we're giving water. Up to now, we are doing the experiment. Nothing had been growing, but we are looking for the rain in order to see. The last study that we are running right now, the part of the restoration, is the rewilding and returning back. We noted that while we start the restoration, the Arabian hare right now returning back to the area, as you see, and we are fixing camera traps in order to see the behavior of the hare, and we are taking measurements for 31 trees, and we count the dung around the trees. As you see in this graph, that there is a correlation between the heights and the dung dynasty. As long as the plant become more height, there is no dung around this plant because they need a plant in order to hide, but they are eating all the plants as you see in the above photos, and those plants and the rabbits, sorry, prefer to eat the small plants, and that's why they are putting dungs behind those plants. Zizivus limularia and Acacia tortilis are most of the palatable plants that are eating, and we are right now studying the stomata in the dungs of the rabbits, and also we are and will compare this with the stomata of the trees that are growing or rehabilitated at the location. This or the fauna, and thank you so much for listening, and sorry for exceeding the time.
No, it's okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed. I mean, I'm glad that you were wrapping up. Okay, so we're almost there. Thank you all for sticking with us. We will go to our next speaker, Mr. Matthew Albrecht from also Missouri Botanical Garden, and he is a conservation scientist at their Center for Conservation and Sustainable Development. The floor is yours, Mr. Matthew.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. And before I begin, I want to first thank the organizers for the invitation to participate in this webinar and to share my research with the group today. So the focus of my talk today is going to be on restoring populations of rare plant species from ex situ collections. And this has been an increasing research and conservation emphasis of botanic gardens throughout the world, including here at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And so in my brief talk today, I'm going to provide an overview of the best practices we are applying to our recovery and restoration programs. And my talk draws heavily on two publications that I would like to kind of promote to the group today. And the first is a publication put out by the Center for Plant Conservation, and this is the best practices to support species survival in the wild. And this is really a comprehensive manual that provides a guide for species recovery and conservation work. It starts off from how you develop an ex situ collection all the way up to how you maintain an ex situ collection, and then how you use that ex situ collection for recovery and restoration work. The second publication I'd like to highlight is one led by my collaborator and colleague, Dr. Joyce Mashinsky, who is the president of the Center for Plant Conservation. And this is a publication that focuses specifically on best practice guidelines for the reintroduction of rare plants. And this publication is available as an open access paper on the World Wide Web. And as a side note, before I begin, I want to also clarify some terminology. So I'm using the word reintroduction synonymously or interchangeably with translocation. And what I mean by this is more broadly any activity that involves the intentional release of individuals into the wild within their historic or indigenous range. And so that's going to be the focus of my talk today. And I'm going to illustrate some of these best practices that we're using in our recovery and reintroduction efforts with one particular species that we've had a long-term reintroduction program with at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And that's Astragalus bibulatus, whose common name is Pine's ground plum. Let me first introduce you to this species before I talk about the program. So this is a slow-growing, nitrogen-fixing herbaceous perennial in the Fabaceae family. It is endemic to dry, rocky grasslands in central Tennessee, which is located in the southeastern US, and it's globally endangered. It's known from only 8 occurrences in the whole world. And the map on the right-hand side of this slide is showing you the geographic range of the species. It's highly restricted. It's endemic to one watershed called the Stones River watershed. And that box on the bottom map with the open circles is showing you where most of the known locations occur for this species. And most locations are distributed along about a 2-kilometer stretch of roadside grasslands. And so this species is incredibly vulnerable to extinction in the wild. We know historically from herbarium specimens that this species was once more broadly distributed within this watershed, and I'm showing you the locations of populations that have since gone extinct over the past century. And the goal of our reintroduction program is trying to reestablish the species in protected areas throughout this historic geographic range of this species. And so the rest of the talk, I'm really going to talk about some of the steps we're taking and some of the lessons we've learned while applying these sort of scientific driven best practice guidelines that we're using with this species. So the first task in any reintroduction program with a rare species is you need to justify the reintroduction. And our philosophy is that reintroduction is not an alternative to in situ conservation, and that there are certain specific reasons why you would be conducting a reintroduction. For example, if the species is extinct in the wild, and then or if the species decline is imminent, it's known from few small populations, and that I've been able to identify the threats for that species, and other in situ conservation measures are not working for this species. And that's certainly the case with this Pines ground plum reintroduction program. Second step in a reintroduction program is to develop a plan. And we've developed a plan at the beginning stages of this project with Pines ground plum. And this plan basically outlines how we're going to implement, how we're going to design the reintroduction program, and how we're going to basically execute the reintroduction with this species. And so having a plan in place before you begin is very important for the long-term success of these projects. And thirdly, partnering with organizations is also critically important for successful reintroduction programs. And in this case, we've been partnering with a variety of different agencies at the federal level here in the United States and at the state level, and with other nonprofit and non-governmental organizations that are involved in conservation. One thing we know about reintroductions is that they're often not successful if you are unable at the beginning to identify threats and what is essentially causing that species to decline in the wild and what might be making it rare. And in the case of this species, Astragalus bibulatus, some early research in our group began monitoring natural populations of this species, and I'm showing you the habitat on the left-hand side. Those are the dry, rocky soil grasslands that this species is endemic to. And the species grows on the edges of these openings, these grasslands that are deeper soil that quickly become invaded by woody vegetation. And what we found is that this woody vegetation is one of the primary threats to this species. And so on the right-hand side, I'm showing you some data from our long-term monitoring program where we're linking plant fitness to how much tree cover is above those individual plants. And so we see a relationship between the number of fruits produced, the number of plants that are flowering, the size of those plants, and with how much woody vegetation is there. And so areas that are more open, have less trees and lower densities of trees, tend to have plants that produce more fruits and tend to have higher fitness. And so we knew at the beginning of our reintroduction program that we were going to need to find locations that had low levels or low amounts of woody vegetation in order to successfully reintroduce the species into the wild. Next step in a reintroduction program is developing a conservation collection. And Andrew White spoke extensively about this earlier, but let me just take a few of those key points and expand on them here. In the case of rare species like Astragalus bibulatus and many others that botanical gardens are working with, they're often incredibly rare in the wild, and typically their natural populations are not producing very much seed. And so you need to build up your ex situ collection over time in order to get enough genetic diversity and enough material to actually carry out your restoration projects. And so for this particular species and other species we've been working with, we have been developing a seed bank for many of these species for the past 25 years and increasing genetic diversity through small sustainable seed collections from the remaining natural populations in the wild. And we've also been doing grow outs and seed increase programs, for example, with Astragalus, where we're taking those accessions, we're growing them out, and then we're cross-pollinating them to amplify or increase the number of seeds we have available for restoration. And as Andrew mentioned in his talk, we're collecting and maintaining everything by maternal line, by individual plants throughout this entire process. And so we're also using some best practice guidelines from the CPC as a sort of guide to how much we should be sampling from the wild in terms of bringing material into our ex situ collection. And this graph I'm showing you on the right-hand side sort of gives you an estimate for how many populations you might need to sample for a rare species in order to adequately capture genetic diversity or genetic variation. And in the case of Pines ground plum, I put a blue arrow for those different species characteristics that we know. And so, for example, with this species, most of the blue arrows are falling on the red side of the spectrum because this is a species known from few populations. It has really small population sizes. Most of those populations are declining in the wild. It has gravity dispersed seeds and has a very narrow distribution. And all of those characteristics mean that we need to be collecting from as many populations and as many individuals as possible to build up enough genetic variation in our ex situ collections in order to effectively reintroduce this species. So you can use these kinds of rules of thumb as guidelines for how you might need to sample and collect material and bring it into your ex situ collection. Next step in our program is actually putting that conservation collection or ex situ collection to use for reintroduction. And there are a couple important points I want to mention here. One is that it's important to choose source material from a location that has similar climatic and environmental conditions to the reintroduction site. And probably one of the most important decisions that need to be made in a restoration program is whether or not you're going to mix your population source material together or you're going to keep it separate. And genetic data can be very useful in helping to make these decisions. And so, for example, with Pines ground plum, I'm showing you on the right-hand side a graph of individuals from wild populations that we have genotyped using microsatellite markers. And these are individuals that we've collected seed from historically and brought into our seed bank at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And what you see from here is that there's a lot of genetic intermixing between most of the populations. And it turns out that most of the wild populations have very low genetic differentiation. And so that tells us that maybe historically there's been quite a bit of gene flow, and that in order to increase the chances of our reintroduction to be successful, we want to have as much genetic variation, as much genetic diversity in those populations. And so we opted to mix our source material together in this particular program based on this genetic data. And finally, I want to point out something that Andrew mentioned in his talk, but I think is critically important in terms of conservation horticulture. And that's the tendency for us when we're growing out material for restoration projects, like what we're doing with Pines ground plum. We tend to sometimes want to select the most vigorous plants in our ex situ propagation. And that's a big no-no. We don't want to do that. We want to have as much phenotypic and as much genetic variation in our collection that we're putting out into the wild, because it may be that plants that don't do well in propagation actually have traits that maybe make them do better in the wild. And so we don't want to select those out of our collections. There are many things we can do as conservation practitioners to increase the chance of establishing and growing a restored populations. So in the case of Pines ground plum, because we have so few seeds available to us in our work, we're propagating that species at the Missouri Botanical Garden and growing out seedlings and planting out 9-month-old transplants. And we know from some of our other work that when you look across these rare species reintroductions, projects that use transplants tend to have greater success than those using seeds. And we also know that if we have larger initial population sizes or founder sizes, like more than 50 individuals at our reintroduction sites, those also tend to have greater chances of having success. If you're using seeds in your reintroductions or your restoration work, then you're probably going to need thousands of seeds to successfully establish and grow your restored populations. Something else that's important for long-term persistence is to try to account for uncertainty in your selection of sites and microsites. Oftentimes, we don't know which microsites may be the most optimal for a species. And so what we're doing in our reintroduction programs is we try to plant out into as much variable microsites as possible to increase the chances of matching the correct genotype to the correct microenvironment. And we think that over time, this will ultimately increase our success of our reintroduction programs. And obviously, the last 2 points in this slide basically link back to some things that were said in previous talks. It's really important to have large genetically diverse founder populations, and it's really important to evenly distribute your maternal lines. And that's so that you don't develop genetic problems down the road that might come up with inbreeding or lack of compatible mates in your population. Something else we advocate strongly for when doing rare plant reintroduction work is to design and implement your program as an experiment. And let me give you an example from our work. So when we first initiated this program with this species, we didn't know the best time of the year to plant seedlings. It was either autumn or spring. And so we designed it as an experiment where we planted half of the individuals in autumn and half in spring. And what I'm showing you here is the survival rate over time of those individual transplants. And you can see that things that were planted in autumn had about over 2 times greater survival rate over this 5-year period. And so in all subsequent reintroductions with this species, we're using autumn as our primary transplant season. We can also use our reintroductions as experiments to test the habitat niche or habitat affinities of rare species, often which we don't know or are poorly understood. In this particular species, it is endemic to limestone in this historic indigenous range, but there are 2 types of different limestones that you can find within this historic range. And we wanted to test whether this species could grow on these 2 different types of limestone. And we experimentally planted individuals on Lebanon and Ridley limestone. And it turns out that this species has a very restricted niche. It can only basically live on one type of limestone substrate, this Lebanon limestone, which tends to be drier and more fragmented and have drier, well-drained soils, compared to the Ridley limestone, which tends to be wetter, have wetter soils. And so here I'm showing you the number of fruits produced per reintroduced plant, fruits produced across our reintroduction sites on Lebanon limestone over a 4-year period. And you can see the number of fruits produced are about 10 times greater on Lebanon than Ridley limestone.
Matthew, just want to take a minute time alert, a 2-minute time alert, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And finally, we also have been experimenting with caging, and it turns out herbivores are incredibly pervasive and persistent threat with this species. And here I'm showing you one of our experimental plots where we have plants that are not caged, shown there with the blue arrows, and then plants that are caged. And you can see the plants that are caged are about 3 or 4 times the size of those that are not caged. And plants that are not caged basically rarely ever flower and produce fruit at our reintroduction sites. So another important factor to consider in your reintroduction programs is to conduct aftercare of the restored population. And this can include things like water, caging, fencing. In the case of our astragalus reintroduction program, it turns out fire is incredibly important for maintaining the openness of these grassland sites and to preventing woody vegetation from establishing. And so you can see our cages in the background. This is one of our reintroduction sites. And you can see we're burning these periodically to keep them open. And that's what this species likes. It's also important to monitor new threats and respond as necessary when things like invasive species begin to colonize your reintroduction sites. You need to have a plan in place to deal with those new threats as they arise. And finally, it's also important to design appropriate monitoring plans. And it's important to adapt your monitoring plan based on the life history of the species. We advocate for gathering demographic data when possible, and that's what we're doing with our Pines ground plum reintroduction program. We're tracking every individual from the time it's collected as seed all the way out to when it's planted at reintroduction sites. We follow the survival, growth, and individual reproductive rates of those plants. Finally, I would like to leave you with a quote that I think is very applicable to reintroductions. This is a quote by Albert Einstein: "The only source of knowledge is experience." And in our work, we have many failures oftentimes before we have successes. And I think this is an important take-home point in any rare plant reintroduction program. And thank you for listening, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you for that presentation. I guess the two speakers that just spoke, Mr. Ahmed and Matthew, are both scientists and on the ground, very hands-on. So what you gave us was an insider's look, or tricks of the trade, basically. Our next speaker is from the Quranic Botanical Garden. We've had 3 presentations, beautiful presentations from the Missouri Botanical Garden, and Mr. Muhammad Hassouna will be our 3rd presenter from the Quranic Botanical Garden, and he is a horticulturist there, and he will be speaking on sustainable management of existing multi-habitat plants within the Quranic Botanical Garden. So, Mr. Hassouna, the floor is yours. Your microphone might be muted, Mr. Hassouna.
نعم. شكرا أخي سليمان. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. المحاضرة أتمنى أولا أن لا أكون ثقيل على المشاهدين لهذا الويبينار. أعلم أنني المتحدث الأخير، وهناك وقت طويل قطعناه في هذه المعلومات الغنية، وسأكون إن شاء الله سريع الطرح، وأتمنى أن أكون عند حسن ظنكم. حضرت المحاضرة باللغة الإنجليزية، ولكن أفضل أن ألقيها باللغة العربية. ولنبدأ مباشرة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذن هناك مشكلة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذا ما تحدثنا عن مركز الصون النباتي في حديقة القرآن النباتية، فهو يعنى ب4 أجزاء رئيسية في الحديقة. الجزء الأول متعلق بتجميع البذور وبنك البذور، والجزء الآخر المعشبة وتوصيف النباتات وتعريفها، والجزء الثالث عن استنبات بذور النباتات، سواء النباتات الفطرية أو النباتات تحت قائمة النباتات المذكورة في القرآن الكريم والأحاديث النبوية الشريفة، وأيضا الأبحاث المتعلقة بها. والجزء الأخير الذي سأتحدث مع حضراتكم وأطلعكم عليه هو برنامج الإكثار النباتي والاستخدام المستدام للنباتات. إذا ما اطلعنا على خريطة توزيع النباتات المذكورة في القرآن الكريم والأحاديث النبوية الشريفة من منظور جغرافي، نجد أن النباتات المذكورة في القرآن الكريم والأحاديث النبوية الشريفة مندرجة تحت 3 أقسام. نباتات موجودة في البيئة الصحراوية، تقريبا 20 نوع من الأنواع النباتية، منها 4 أجناس أو 4 أنواع من الأكاشيا والأرتميزيا، الاستراجيلس، الأنواع عديدة. تمركس أفيلا حديقة القرآن النباتية عملت على تجميعها في منشورات عديدة، منها هذا المنشور الذي أحمله في يدي، ونستطيع أيضا أن نشاركهم مع بعض المتحدثين الذين طلبوا نسخة أو التعرف على أنواع هذه النباتات. والجزء الآخر من النباتات موجود في المنطقة المعتدلة أو منطقة مناخ حوض البحر الأبيض المتوسط، ويندرج تحته تقريبا 30 نوع من الأنواع النباتية، وهو يشمل أيضا معظم النباتات الحولية أو النباتات التي تعيش لمدة عام واحد، كالقمح والشعير والحبة السوداء والبصل والثوم وغيره من هذه الأنواع، إلى جانب أيضا التين والزيتون وغيرها من الأشجار والشجيرات المعروفة في منطقة حوض المتوسط والمناطق المعتدلة الحرارة. الجزء الثالث من النباتات المذكورة أيضا يقع في المنطقة الاستوائية وتحت الاستوائية، وهي تقريبا 9 إلى 10 أنواع، منها طبعا شجرة العود والقسط الهندي والكافور والورس والموز والأرز والزنجبيل والزرع. إذا ما اطلعنا كخلفية عن درجات الحرارة الموجودة تحت مناخ دولة قطر، نجد أن أشهر منتصف نوفمبر حتى منتصف فبراير من كل عام هو الجزء المعتدل من السنة، بينما يبدأ المناخ في ارتفاع درجة الحرارة من شهر أبريل إلى أن يصل إلى ذروة الارتفاع في شهر يونيو ويوليو وأغسطس من كل عام. وبالتالي عملية إكثار النباتات أو الحصول على الموارد الوراثية لعملية الإكثار تكون صعبة وتكون تحدي وسط هذا الارتفاع من درجات الحرارة. إذا ما تحدثنا عن مشتل حديقة القرآن النباتية، هو موجود داخل مشتل مؤسسة قطر، وهو يعتبر المشتل الأم، وهو مشتل بني على مساحة 90,000 متر مربع على أحدث الطراز، يعتبر فريد من نوعه في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، نظرا لأنه تم تصميمه على أن يتم جمع النباتات الفطرية الموجودة في دولة قطر لاستخدامها استخدام في مشاريع التجميل الحضاري بالمدينة التعليمية. المشتل يضم العديد من الوحدات طبعا ذات بنية تحتية عالية الجودة التي تسمح بإكثار مجموعة هائلة جدا من النباتات، وأيضا استخدام المستدام للمياه داخله. يتم أو معظم الإنتاج الخاص بمشتل مؤسسة قطر يمد المدينة التعليمية بالأنواع النباتية المطلوبة فيها، وطبعا بعد عملية التحديث الكبيرة التي تمت في البنية التحتية وأيضا اللاندسكيب والتنسيق الحضاري داخل المدينة التعليمية، التي تعتبر وجهة فريدة داخل دولة قطر ودول الخليج العربي ومنطقة الشرق الأوسط بالكامل. إذا تحدثنا عن مشتل حديقة القرآن النباتية تحديدا، نجد أنه يوجد به 5 أقسام: البروباجيشن رومز أو غرف الإكثار، والصوبات التي بها أنظمة تبريد، وأيضا صوبات مهيئة لاستيعاب الأنواع الاستوائية، وصوبات مضللة للنباتات الموجودة في المنطقة الصحراوية ومنطقة حوض البحر الأبيض المتوسط. المنطقة الأولى هي مشتل خاص بالأنواع النباتية الجافة والمعتدلة، وتضم العديد من النباتات كما يمكن أن نراها، مثل طبعا الألوفيرا، مثل الفيكس كاريكا، مثل أشجار السدر، أشجار السيراميكي أو شجيرات السيراميكي، العديد من الأنواع النباتية التي تفضل أن تعيش أو يمكن إكثارها بسهولة داخل أو خارج المناطق المفتوحة بسهولة. المنطقة الثانية هو مشتل الأنواع النباتية من المناطق الاستوائية وشبه الاستوائية، وطبعا بيتم في هذا البيت المحمي إكثار النباتات الموجودة في المنطقة الاستوائية، مثل الزنجبيل، مثل القسط الهندي، مثل الموز، مثل شجرة العود، مثل أنواع عديدة، حتى الزرنب، زنبرت، وأنواع أخرى من النباتات الاستوائية التي يمكن تهيئة درجات الحرارة المطلوبة لها. هناك أيضا مشتل داخل مشتل حديقة القرآن النباتية خاص بالأنواع النباتية من فلورا قطر، وسأتحدث عن هذا المشروع الذي بدأنا فيه لتجميع النباتات الفطرية وصونها خارج الموئل الطبيعي لإعادة توطينها مرة أخرى. هناك أيضا مشتل خاص بالأنواع ذات الطبيعة التقنية الخاصة، مثل نخيل المكثر بتقنية زراعة الأنسجة، وهناك ومعظمها سلالات خاصة أو أنواع من النخيل تتفرد بها دولة قطر، مثل الفاص والبرحي والشيشي ونبت سيف وغيرها من الأنواع التي تشرف عليها الدولة وتوجد داخل مشاتل حديقة القرآن النباتية. المنطقة الخامسة والأخيرة هو مشتل إكثار تحت ظروف التحكم الحراري، وفيه يتم التحكم بدرجات حرارة مناسبة. غالبا نستخدم هذا المكان للبذور بعد عملية استنباتها أو للعقل بعد خروجها من غرف الإنبات، زي ما تشاهدون في الشاشات أمامكم. بيكون المرحلة انتقالية ما بين خروج النباتات إلى المناطق الخارجية وخروجها من غرف الإنبات. إذا تحدثنا عن غرف الإنبات الموجودة في حديقة القرآن النباتية، يتم التحكم فيها بشكل كامل من خلال الضوء، الحرارة، الرطوبة، بحيث توفر بيئة كاملة لإكثار هذه النباتات بكل الطرق، سواء جنسية أو لا جنسية، طوال العام. أيضا في هذه الغرف يمكن لنا استخدام مجموعة واسعة أو إكثار مجموعة واسعة من النباتات. نظرة على تاريخية على تجميعات حديقة القرآن النباتية من النباتات منذ عام 2008 إلى عام 2020 لدينا في الحديقة تقريبا 42,000 نبات، معظمهم يعني بيتم استخدامهم في حملات التوعية والزراعة المستدامة في الحديقة وغيرها منذ عام 2008 وحتى 2020. إذا ما نظرنا إلى أيضا هذا الدياجرام عفوا يؤشر لنا في البدايات في عام 2008 كانت نسبة الأشجار لا تتعدى 10%، بينما في عام 2020 نسبة الأشجار تقترب من 50%. وهذا يعني يدلل على أننا كنا في بداية المشروع بنتجه إلى عملية الترويج وعملية تعريف المجتمع بالنباتات، ولم تكن البنية أو الانفراستراكشر موجودة لدينا في هذا الوقت، وبالتالي كنا يعني نركز على إنتاج النباتات الصغيرة التي يمكن حملها من مكان إلى آخر. لذلك نجد أن أكثر الكميات التي ننتجها في البدايات في عام 2008 إلى 2011 كانت شربات أو أشجار صغيرة أو نباتات حولية. أما منذ 2015 انتقلنا إلى مشتل مؤسسة قطر في مشتل حديقة القرآن النباتية المجهز بهذه الإمكانيات، وبدأ منحنى إنتاج الأشجار الكبيرة يأخذ في الاتساع كما يظهر أمام حضراتكم. هذا العام على سبيل المثال في 2020 لدينا 6388 شجرة موجودة داخل أبنية الحديقة، لدينا 2050 شجيرة، 1899 نبات معمر، و3107 نبات حولي موجودين داخل مشاتل حديقة القرآن النباتي. إذا تحدثنا عن إكثار أو طرق الإكثار التي يتم استخدامها في حديقة القرآن النباتية، بيتم إنتاج النباتات وفق مجموعة كبيرة من أنواع الإكثار، أهمها طبعا أو النوع الشائع والذي نستخدمه على نطاق واسع هي العقل، منها العقل الورقية، العقل الساقية، عقل النباتات ذات الأخشاب الغضة والأخشاب الجافة والهارد وود، وأيضا عقل الجذور. على سبيل المثال هذا النبات الذي نراه سنسيفيريا امبرجانا هو نبات السيسال من منطقة شرق أفريقيا، واستجلبناه من سلطنة عمان، وبنقوم إكثاره بالورقة، ومن نبات واحد أصبح لدينا عدة نباتات. الكاكتوس نفس طريقة الإكثار، بيتم إكثاره بالورقة. إذا ما تحدثنا عن الإكثار بالعقل الساقية فنجد أن لدينا مجموعة كبيرة مثل الليبتيدينيا أو الفيكس كاريكا، السلفادورا بيرسيكا، الفوربيا ميلي، زيلا سباينوزا، وغيرها من النباتات التي نقوم على إكثارها بالعقل الساقية. لدينا أيضا إكثار بالعقل عن طريق الهارد وود مثل نبات الأكاشيا جلبيني والفيتس كاستوس وترميناليا والمورس ألبا، هيبسكس تيليسيوس، أنواع عديدة من النباتات كالحنة، العوسج الليثيوم شوياي، السترس. وهذه الصور يعني توضح لكم بعض طرق الإكثار الذي تحدثنا عليها، منها نبات التامركس أفيلا أو السيبرس سمبرفنسيس، والأوليا أوروبيا، الزيتون، أكاشيا امبرجانا، حتى الأكاشيا التي يتم إكثارها بالبذرة أيضا حاولنا إكثارها عن طريق العقل الخشبية. والبوغنفيليا هذه الشجرة الجميلة، الليثيوم شوياي، العوسج، المسواك، وغيرها من النباتات. أيضا بنقوم بإكثار النباتات بهربيشيس كاتنجز مثل نبات القص الهندي. أيضا بنقوم بالبلوماريا، أيضا نقوم بإكثارها بنفس الطريقة. أيضا هناك العديد من الأنواع النباتية التي نقوم بإكثارها بنفس الطرق، مثل نبات بانيكام تيرجينم على سبيل المثال، أيضا نقوم بإكثاره بالعقلة وأحيانا بالتفصيص. إذا ما انتقلنا أيضا إلى طريقة أخرى نستخدمها في حديقة القرآن النباتية هي الليرنج أو الترقيد. نستخدم الترقيد الهوائي، نستخدم الترقيد الأرضي، ونستخدم أيضا الماوند ليرنج أو الترقيد الهرمي. الترقيد الهوائي نستخدمه على مجموعة واسعة من النباتات مثل الزيتون، مثل التين، مثل أيضا شجرة العود، وهي شجرة مهددة بالانقراض. في بعض الأوقات كانت هناك إشارات على نجاح بعض تجارب الترقيد، ولكن لم تكمل معنا، بطيئة جدا جدا في نمو الجذور. لكن على يمين الشاشة نجد شجرة الزيتون سريعة جدا جدا والجذور واضحة من كيس الترقيد. التين أيضا شجرة سريعة جدا جدا في إنتاج الترقيد. نستخدم أيضا بعض تقنيات الترقيد الأرضي مثل ما تم على شجرة السدر، كذلك استخدمناه على شجرة القص أو نبات القص الهندي. أيضا الماونت لايرنج أو التقييد الهرمي، بنقوم بعمل هرم حول جذع النبات من الأسفل، وبالتالي هناك تفريعات كثيرة بتنشأ نتيجة الرطوبة الموجودة في هذا الهرم، ومنه نستطيع أن نحصد كمية كبيرة من النباتات الجديدة. هناك أيضا طريقة التقسيم أو التجزيء نستخدمه على أنواع عديدة مثل الموز، مثل السندبوبن، تشيلوكوستوس، الألوفيرا وغيرها. في هذه الصورة نرى تشيلوكوستوس سبيسيوس أيضا بنقوم بعملية تفصيصه. الأكورس كالامس ننتجه بهذا الشكل. طيفا دوميشنسيس أيضا بنقوم بإكسارها بالتفصيص. الجنجر أو الزنجبيل نستخدم أيضا تقنية أو التطعيم على بعض النباتات منها السيمفورا وأيضا على السيترس ميديكا. كما الروت كاتنجز أيضا بنستخدمه على بعض النباتات منها المنثى أو النعناع. هناك أيضا تيشو كلتشر وبرنامج خاص مع وزارة البلدية والبيئة بنخيل الطنق. هناك أيضا لحديقة القرآن النباتية سعي في عمل تجميعات صحراوية من النباتات. كمرحلة أولى قمنا بجمع 45 نوع من النباتات الموجودة في البر القطري، وهذه الصورة هذا النبات موجود في البر، وهذا النبات بعد نقله واستئناسه كنوع من أنواع الصون خارج الموقع في الحديقة. وهذه كل الصور من التجميعات التي نقوم بجمعها وحفظها في الحديقة. أيضا برنامج الصون يعتمد على استخدام دلائل علمية باستخدام تربة معينة وهرمونات. بنقوم بتجزئة أو تصنيف العقل على حسب مواصفات علمية، بحيث يتم الحصول على أفضل النتائج فيها. متابعة عملية الإكثار وفق نهج علمي. أيضا استخدام خليط متوازن من الترب للإنتاج. وأيضا بنقوم برصد كل الظواهر أو معظم الظواهر التي نستطيع رصدها في الحديقة أو داخل المشتى. أيضا بنستعين أو بالبيانات العالمية مثل منظمة الأمم المتحدة للأغذية والزراعة وكابي وكيو جاردنز لتوصيف بعض النباتات والحصول على مؤشرات كالمؤشرات الموجودة على الشاشة على سبيل المثال ليس الحصر. وأيضا تساعدنا هذه المؤشرات في فهم مجموعة النباتات المذكورة في القرآن الكريم وفي الأحاديث النبوية الشريفة، وبالتالي تساعدنا في عملية الصون وفي عملية تحديد الموئل المناسب للصون خارج الموقع كما هو موجود في هذا الدياجرام. أيضا نستطيع أن نفهم من تحليل البيانات الموجودة في هذه القواعد البيانية فهم أنواع التربة المناسبة لهذه الأنواع. إذن في أيضا
محمد, I just want to give you a 2 minute.
بنستخدم تقنيات كثيرة للتعرف لتتبع درجات الحرارة والرطوبة. نعم. وأيضا قياس تركيز الكلوروفيل في بعض النباتات، واستخدام بعض الأجهزة الصغيرة التي يمكننا من خلالها أيضا التعرف على يعني كل المخاطر التي تحيط بالنبات في المشتى. أيضا بنقوم بتوصيف التربة على حسب كل نوع من أنواع التربة بما يتناسب مع سواء الجيرمينيشن أو يتناسب مع السيدلينج أو يتناسب مع الأشجار الصغيرة أو الكبيرة. على حسب كل مخلوط بيتم تصنيفه. بنستخدم التربة المستوردة من الخارج، وأيضا بنستخدم الترب المنتجة داخل دولة قطر ويتم خلطها في هذا الشكل. ختاما إن شاء الله حديقة القرآن الكريم بتقوم حاليا ببناء البيت الاستوائي، وهو بيت متفرد أكبر من البيوت التي تم عرضها في هذا العرض لاستيعاب كمية أكبر من النباتات الاستوائية وخاصة تلك المهددة بالانقراض. وبالتالي نعمل على يعني زيادة قدرة الحديقة في صون النباتات خارج موطنها الأصلي، وإن كانت بالتحديد النباتات المهددة بالانقراض في مواقعها الأصلية كنوع من حفظ النبات خارج الموقع. وأشكركم شكرا جزيلا، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muhammad Hassouna. It's not easy to be the last speaker, but you did well and you did it within the time, and I appreciate your contributions. Thank you to all of the audience members watching us from different parts of the world, from Qatar and from outside of Qatar. And since this is an online webinar, I think we must kind of do some of the rituals that come with doing online events. And if I may just ask all the speakers to turn on their cameras so we can have a group photo, a massive screenshot, that would be very much appreciated. And then we'll just take a couple of minutes to kind of like go into a discussion. We're not going to open it too much because I've already seen some very interesting interactions on the chat and some questions were answered there, but we will open up the mic. One of my colleagues will be able to at least open up the mics for 3 people to be able to directly engage with the speakers. And then finally, if the speakers have final thoughts that they would like to share in 1 minute, the floor will also be given to them before we close. So if everyone can please prepare for the screenshot for the group photo.
Abdurrahman can do it.
Okay. So whenever Abdurrahman is ready, I would, he can give us a countdown or.
Okay, then, thank you.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Abdurrahman. For that. So yes, Abdurrahman, maybe if there's anybody from the audience who would like to at least ask a question that wasn't yet discussed in the chat, we can have 3 questions for the panelists.
I think here there is the.
I appreciate people's patience. And if there's none, then maybe at least final thoughts from the speakers. And apologies definitely for some of the technical difficulties that we had at the beginning, but I think we've done fairly well to cover a lot of topics here in the time that we had allotted. And I want to thank also the audience members for being patient with us and for sticking with us in the program all the way to the end. Final thoughts, anyone?
I think Dr. Laila here, she need to ask something. Dr. Laila Muhammad. Okay, until the Sulaiman, maybe we can ask the panelists.
Yes, please. I mean, I don't want to. I don't know if you want to go in the same order that you went, or if you want to go in the reverse order. But
I actually have a question for Matthew.
Perfect.
Matthew, okay, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I was interested in the data that you were showing about replanting times. You did one in autumn and one in spring. Interesting enough, the UK team did a reintroduction of ranunculus, which is quite a rare species of ranunculus, back into kind of marshy area in Gloucestershire. And they initially aimed at replanting during the flowering stage, and the idea was to maximize essentially seed production and dispersal when it's in the natural environment. I wondered what your thoughts are in terms of, a little bit, would you recommend planting out during the fruiting stage instead, or would you recommend doing multiple plantings in different stages?
Question. Thank you. I would say it really depends on the species and the habitat that you're planting into. So in the case of the case study I gave you in this presentation, its natural phenology is in spring, yet when we planted in spring, the plants did worse than when we planted in autumn. And we think that's because, in this case, the spring window is very narrow before it gets like really hot and dry. And so we're putting out pretty big plants that have big root systems, and we just don't think they get established enough in time before the hot and dry season. Whereas when we plant in the cooler fall weather, it gives plants an opportunity to establish in like more benign environmental conditions. And so we think that's what's related to success there. So I think it really sort of depends a lot on the species, the propagation technique, and the system that you're planting into. So I'm not sure like that particular example is broadly applicable to a whole bunch of other species and other systems, but it may be applicable to other rare species in those limestone grasslands.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe if you'd allow me, Mr. Jackson, any final thoughts from your side, sir?
Well, thank you very much. I must say this has been a really fascinating webinar. There were a lot of great detail, and I hope the presentations people will find very useful for those who are considering or undertaking ecological restoration work in their own institutions. There were a few takeaway messages that I got from it. One was that it's very clear that each institution needs to have a very clear commitment, a very carefully planned approach, and also good capacity to undertake ecological restoration work. A second thought is that any ecological restoration work that is undertaken needs to be undertaken on the basis of really good research results and ongoing research monitoring of any work that is done. Another takeaway is how crucial it is to have really good horticultural facilities and processes involved. And then finally, the success of an ecological restoration program seems to me to be at various levels. The need to approach it at the macro level, considering the habitats and all of the ecological pressures, including the threats, and also at the micro level, looking at the survival and restoration and of individual species and individual plants too. And combining all of those elements that have come through this webinar, I think is the recipe for success for any institution undertaking ecological restoration. It's been a fascinating webinar, and I'm so grateful to all of the presenters and to our partners in this, the Quranic Botanic Garden. And I'm so thankful for Dr. Fatima, Dr. Ahmed, and all of the people involved in helping to present it.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Paul Smith, for me, it was exciting as a moderator to actually be at an event where one of the panelists is quoted multiple times, and your name was showed up multiple times in various presenters' slides. So your final thoughts.
Well, just to say thank you to everybody. I learned a lot. I always do, and I'm always gratified by the depth of knowledge within our community. And I think, the challenge for us is twofold. The first is that we bring scientific rigor to the process of ecological restoration. And there's a lot of people out there, corporate companies, governments, NGOs that are busy planting trees for carbon sequestration, for livelihoods. But I'm afraid that very often that data is not collected and we're not learning how to do it better. With the skills in Botanic Gardens and the approaches that we take, also our collections, which are, of course, are documented, we have the opportunity to add considerably to knowledge and the science of ecological restoration. However, we don't have much time. And there are not nearly enough of us engaged in this. And I took that from Andrew's talk. He's absolutely right. We don't have enough people in Botanic Gardens engaged in conservation work, let alone ecological restoration. So we need to up our game. We need to get better at this, and we need to take it more seriously, because I think we have a responsibility based on our scientific knowledge, our collections. We know how to grow a wider range of plant diversity than any other professional community on this planet. And it is therefore really important that we get engaged with practitioners at scale and bring in our knowledge and our approaches. So that's the challenge I would leave the group with. But also congratulations, I think, to the quality of the work that is being undertaken. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Mr. Ahmed Al-Kharib has a question, so I'll just, it seems like it's a burning question. If you'd like to ask the question, Ahmed.
Actually, I need to ask Matthew and to ask Paul as well for two things. For Matthew, have you studied the allelopathic effect of the species in both limestones in autumn and spring? This might affect why we could understand more why those species don't grow here in this kind of habitats and grow in that kind of habitats. Maybe there is allelopathic effect of other species may affect this. And for Paul, thank you so much for all the great efforts of the BGCI, and and congratulations for the latest report of the tree assessment. And if we at the Quranic Botanic Garden need to be a part of the tree assessment, and how we need to unify, as I send you in personal, unify the data of the data collection of the assessment in order to be within the global report. As you see here, many people work in the restoration, but as Hatem mentioned, nobody do actual restoration in the arid ecosystem. Most of the restoration in the forests and reforestation, but no documents. We need to start together with Missouri Botanic Garden, with BGCI, to put a guideline for restoration of the desert ecosystems. It's a time to put this kind of a guideline, and Dr. Peter, you may agree with this, because there is no guideline, especially particularly for this kind of habitat. We need the main goal of this webinar is to networking between the Botanic Garden, especially in Arabia. I think in Arabia, they are still inactive. So we need to activate this networking, and we start with a certain project. And I think Dr. Fatima, she allow all of this gathering to communicate together, to come out with a certain project in this region, with especially within the 10 years of restoration. And thank you so much for gathering, and sorry for giving me give you a hard time. Thank you.
Let me respond, if I may. Well, we'd welcome you, of course, joining the Ecological Restoration Alliance. It's clear that there's a lot going on. The Royal Botanic Gardens Jordan is already part of that alliance, and so that element of dryland restoration is important. And as you say, we also have, and I'll let Kirsty mention in a moment, that we have practitioners in Africa as well, in desert systems and in dryland systems. So I think that we need to be learning from each other, and as you say, networking and joining each other, in this. You'll have seen also one of the key examples of the Great Green Wall project in the Sahel. There is quite a lot of experience now in dryland restoration, not just in forest restoration, but I think not enough communication, as I say, and also, getting together like this is really quite important. It's no good just using the literature, because I think the scientific literature is not probably the best medium for publishing and exchanging knowledge, because it has to be new and people are chasing impact factors and so on. So I think fora like this, and I think I hope that the Ecological Restoration Alliance will hold meetings similar to the one in Jordan a few years ago that focus specifically on dryland restoration. So I'm going to put Kirsty on the spot as our head of ecological restoration to respond to that.
Just to say that we would really welcome more members from the region, and it was really great to hear some more examples today. So I'm just about to post the email address again into the chat, but please do get in touch, because it would be great to be having more botanic gardens on board. And just to say again that you don't have to be experts in ecological restoration already to join the Alliance. One of the main benefits of joining the Alliance is to learn from other members. So yeah, please get in touch with us. Thanks. And thank you very much for today. It was great.
As Mr. Haytham Taifour, would you like to say any final thoughts in 1 minute?
Dr. Matthew, we didn't answer yet.
Oh, really? Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so just briefly, surprisingly, the plant communities, Ahmad, are very similar on the two different types of limestone. And so you get very similar species growing in the same spots that we did our reintroductions. And we think it has to do with drainage, because when we propagate the species in an ex situ setting, we notice when we don't get the soil drainage correctly in the pots, we get a lot of disease and the plants don't perform as well. And so we think it has to do with the way the soil drains on the different types of limestone rather than some sort of plant-plant interaction. But it's a really interesting hypothesis that maybe we could try to test in the future. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew. Sorry about that. I just kind of slipped my mind. Mr. Haytham Taifour?
Yes, again, thank you for this fantastic webinar. I just would like to highlight something that the need to conduct research at the regional level, as future work should focus on the magnitude of land use and climate change impact. And it's imperative to understand their combined effect for land conservation at the regional scale. As studied, that include only one of these factors are likely inadequately assess the impact of both on vegetation cover in general. So this is my point.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Andrew Wyatt, did I skip Ms. Aisha Farouk? I did. Aisha, because you had asked your question earlier, but please, if you have a final thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has been said already, the interesting talks, the great breadth of experience that's in this room right now is really amazing. And it's really good to see that there is potential of kind of expanding that into the ERA and looking at more you know, grasslands and dryland areas, because indeed those are places that really need looking at, as well as forests as well. Just a final thought in terms of seed supply. You know, looking at the quality, the quantity, and the diversity of those seed supplies is absolutely key to ensuring that restoration targets can actually take place in a sustainable and resilient way. I know botanical gardens have, you know, an immense diversity of different species, and getting in touch or linking that up to, you know, seed practitioners or, you know, within the commercial sense would really help greatly in expanding that kind of seed supply, or the challenge of seed supply, and also understanding genetic diversity as well. So the whole idea of multidisciplinary approach, getting in touch with genetics, people who work in genetic analysis, people who work in population diversity analysis will be also a great benefit moving forward. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Andrew Wyatt.
Yeah, I think it's been a great conference because of all of the different expertise that have been brought to bear. And I think it illustrates that larger vision where we need to kind of communicate and plan together. But it also illustrates how important it is for us to work on protocols on everyday practice as well, all the way from horticulture to seed banking to restoration ecology, and linking all of that together is I think key for success. And I think, you know, sharing of data, sharing of knowledge, and being able to deliver that is where we are. And then just boosting the number of people in botanic gardens and outside botanic gardens collaborating and working together along these principles of building species-rich collections, of building genetic diversity, and then doing that in a way that allows us to deliver that into restoration projects effectively, so that we don't lose that data as we lose that data and lose the ability to be able to do that through process. So So I think it's been a great conference. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Kirsty, any final thoughts, Kirsty Shaw?
Yeah, just to say thank you again. I agree. It's been a really great session. We're really missing out a bit at the moment with COVID not being able to get together, but doing sessions like this really helps to remind us all of the network that's out there and bring us all together. And yeah, I hope everybody has found it very interesting. And yeah, just thanks for attending. Thanks to the organizers of the session. And yeah, please sign up to the Ecological Restoration Alliance.
Ahmed Al-Kharib. Thank you, Kirsty.
Thank you for all. Thanks for all the expertise that joined this webinar. It is a great opportunity for us to share the knowledge, for networking, and we will, inshallah, do our best to do more efforts for conservation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Matthew Albrecht, any final thoughts?
Thank you for this webinar. This has been a great learning experience to hear all of the great presentations today. I guess my take home for those who were in the audience might be to do recovery, conservation, and restoration is going to require a great deal of breadth in terms of expertise from horticulture, from ecology, to restoration ecology. You're going to need all of those different layers of expertise in order to have successful projects. And so I think that's one of the take-home messages I came out here from this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Hasuna, Muhammad.
Yes, it's a great honor for me to be with you today and share the advances of Quranic Botanic Garden in terms of horticulture fields. I just would like to emphasize on the need for more collaboration between Botanic Garden in terms of exchange experience. We are, as a Botanic Garden here in arid land, are also conserving plants from tropical species and from Mediterranean species. And we are facing many challenges to source such type of plants from different countries due to trade restrictions, due to research also restrictions, communications not face big gap, in completing the process of exchange materials. So we need to build really solid cooperation between Botanic Garden to help us to be more realistic in exchanging the materials among us. And a great honor for me to be benefit from the information shared from Missouri Botanic Garden, BGCI, Kew Botanic Gardens, Millennium Gene Bank, all other institutions, and thank you for all participants who are listening to us throughout 3 hours. Thank you so much, and thanks for Dr. Peter Weiss Jackson. After seeing him since 2014 here in our conference in Doha.
Perfect, thank you. I mean, so it's been a great virtual reunion for some people, and I mean, for me, it's been a great learning moment to hear from all of your expertise and your insights. And I want to ask the audience to join me in thanking the panelists. I mean, however you would like to do it, whether it's clapping, whether it's the emojis that are on here, but please, I'm sure we've already seen many people saying thank you in Arabic and in English. The audience, I mean, the panelists, the audience stayed to hear the panelists all the way to the end. I mean, kudos to the panelists for that. So, and I guess also on behalf of the panelists and the audience, we should also give thanks to the interpreters for bridging the language divide and for being able to kind of keep up with us and the pace of the material and what we were saying. So kudos to the interpreters as well. And I want to thank all of you. To be honest with you, for me, like I said, I've learned a lot, and I hope that this is just the beginning of many more interactions like this where we can learn from each other, because we know what is at stake. I think it was Mr. Jackson who mentioned it, the twin global challenges of either climate change and not either biodiversity loss. And we don't want either of those to be affecting us or the future generations. So all hands on deck, inshallah, to kind of try to prevent that and working with your expertise. And I mean, I want to say thank you for staying with us for 3 hours, from all of us to the organizers, for their vote of confidence to allow me to moderate this. I've learned a lot. Thank you all. And I think from Doha, we want to say assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you.
Thank you, Suleiman, for your work as well on this.
It's a pleasure. I've learned a lot.
You're a great moderator. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suleiman. Thank you so much.